harassment, discrimination, and
所以我们今天的讨论会呢，是要讨论就是经过这个费城学区他们所发布的这个要保护避免歧视的这个复学的计划。所以现在大家荧幕上可以看到的是今天我们邀请来的讲员。我们会请学生跟老师先讨论一下。Go ahead.
Questions can be posed at in the chat box at any time, but we will take the questions at the end of the program.
所以在荧幕的下方有一个 chat box，OK，CHAT。你们如果在这个讲座的过程当中有任何的问题的话，你只要点上这个 CHAT 的这个 chat box， 然后把你的问题可以用中文写进去，然后我们讲座完了以后会来回答你的问题。
There are going to be 2 polls for anyone who wants CLE credits. They'll be between the student and teacher's perspectives and Anna's perspectives, and then the legal stuff at the end. So 2 polls. If you want CLE credit, Pennsylvania CLE credit, make sure you fill in those polls. There's also going to be a short evaluation at the end. So we'll ask you to answer those questions too at the end of the program.
所以如果我们有2个部分，就是如果你需要今天听这个讲座拿到那个宾州的 CLE 的那个学分的话你可以，我们有两个方面，一个是学生跟老师发表的，然后还有呢就是 Anna Anna Perng 她所发表的，还有就是我们讨论一些法律上的问题。
I wanted to introduce our speakers. So Ken Hung is a social studies teacher at Central High School in Philadelphia. He currently teaches world history, IB global politics, and AP European history. We also have 3 seniors from Central High School. Lin is currently the president of the Asian Pacific Islander Union, APIU. APIU has been focused on student organizing during this time and has hosted workshops about imperialism and racial consciousness. One priority of APIU is to raise awareness of and resist problematic policies while bringing a youth perspective to these issues. Jaira Marco
现在先邀请的是这个就是中央高中的一位老师，他是教社会科学的，他的名字叫做 Kenneth Hung。他今年呢教的课是世界历史，还有就是环球的历史，还有他们的 AP 的这个历史课。然后我们请了3位就是快要毕业的12年级的学生。第一位小姐名字叫做玲，她是他们的这个 senior class， 就是12年级学生的这个学生会长。她是这个他们的这个亚裔的一个组织的会长叫做 APIU。那所以她平常呢组织很多活动，然后也是要帮助大家能够提倡这个亚裔的一些权利。Go ahead.
Thank you. Jaira Marcos is currently serving as treasurer of APIU. APIU promotes solidarity amongst AAPI students and other students of color. She also works on The Bullhorn, a student-run newspaper dedicated to informing students of news, events, and more.
然后第2位学生呢，他的名字叫做 Jaira Marcos， 他也是这个 APIU 他们这个亚裔学生会的一个成员。他的责任呢是帮助他们管理他们的基金。他也参与学校的一个学生报纸，这个发表一些作品。
And Aleena Tan is a member of APIU, and as part of that group, she works to provide a safe space for members to process difficult issues while informing them about Asian American history and and issues.
然后第3位学生呢，他的名字叫做 Aleena， 他也是这个 APIU 的成员。他的责任是提供给所有的学生一个安全的一个场地，让大家能够分享这个亚洲的历史。
Perng is a disabled Asian American advocate and parent. She's the founder of the Chinatown Disability Advocacy Project and was President Obama's designee to the White House Interagency Council on Women and Girls. She is currently leading the Philadelphia COVID-19 Health Equity Coalition to promote vaccine equity.
Perng 她是我们的一个社区领导人物，她是这个华府残障人士宣导组织的一个发起人。她平常呢，她是帮助大家帮亚裔争取权利，也帮助这个残障的人士争取他们的权利。他在过去，他也在那个奥巴马总统的竞选的那个工作过，产生很多贡献。
Robin Lipp is an associate at Berney Sang. His practice focuses on federal appeals, education law, and employment law. Robin earned his JD from Harvard Law School and his Master of Public Policy from the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. Before joining Berney Sang, Robin clerked for the Honorable Kathy Bassoon of the U.S. District Court for the Western District of Pennsylvania.
下一位讲员呢，他的名字叫做 Robin Lipp， 他是这个 Berney Sang 这个律师会的一个成员。他的过去的背景呢，他是哈佛大学法学院毕业，他也在哈佛的一个学校里面拿了一个硕士。基本上他的这个法律上的他有很多的经验。他在过去也加入了这个美国联邦政府的法庭，在里面工作过。
And Robin is actually coming in at the last minute because we had another panelist scheduled to join us, Jennifer Sang. She could not make it today, and Robin has graciously stepped in, but I wanted to tell you a little bit about Jennifer because she did a lot of the work for this program today. So Jennifer is a partner at the law firm of Berney Sang. She represents families in special education cases and bullying and harassment matters. And she is co-chair of APABA-PA's Community Outreach Committee.
今天呢 ，Robin Lipp 他是我们最后请他来，因为我们原本要邀请的讲员是 Jennifer Sang。Jennifer Sang 她是 Berney Sang 这个律师楼的一个合伙人。她今天有事，她不能来，所以我们邀请 Robin Lipp 来取代她。那可是因为 Jennifer Sang 也是对大家有很多贡献的一个非常棒的一个律师，我们要简介她一下。她的专长是教育法律，那她帮助了很多这个残疾人士跟这个特殊教育这一方面的法律程序。
All right, I think that's all the preliminary comments I had. Ken, do you want to take it away?
All right, thank you, everyone. So again, my name is Ken Hung, or Xing Hong. I am a social studies teacher at Central High School. Just so you know, I have 2 children who are running around and they may interrupt me at any moment. So I just want to give you a heads up. Also, Agnes, I don't have a whole lot of experience with speaking and interpretation. So please just interrupt me at any point where you need to come in and translate.
I will. 所以这位洪老师，他先跟大家自我介绍一下啊，他的名字叫做 Kenneth Hung。洪老师呢，他是在中央高中的一个社会科学的老师。他今天很高兴来跟大家做这个讲座。 他要先让大家知道他有2个孩子在家里，所以如果他们发一些声音的话，请大家不要介意。Go ahead.
All right, so I want to thank everybody for being here today, and in particular, the students and parents who are here. And I also want to thank the students and parents and activists who are part of this panel who are going to share their stories about the way that anti-Asian violence has impacted them in the last year, but also throughout their lives. So what I'm going to be doing is trying to just provide some context into what our other presenters are going to be talking about based upon my experience as an educator in the Philadelphia public schools and as an Asian American.
所以今天洪老师呢，他非常感谢大家来听我们的讲座。今天他会邀请一些学生跟家长来讨论一下，就是在过去这一段时间当中，他们自己因为这个亚裔的歧视的这些犯罪的案件，或者是这个亚裔歧视的这个事实，他们自己所经历过的一些事情。那洪老师也会跟我们分享一些内容，就是我们一些内容跟数据。
All right, so what I want to talk about first is the way that we frame anti-Asian violence in the news and in particular in schools. From my perspective, I feel that when we hear about anti-Asian violence, we tend to focus on 2 things. We focus on spectacle and we focus on statistics. We focus on these understandably horrible stories of elderly people who were beaten up, or we focus on these numbers, right? Like many of us have probably seen this number that's from March 19th, 2020 to February 2021, there were roughly about 3,700, 3,800 incidents of anti-Asian violence. I think it's really important to focus on these things as they call attention to the gravity of the situation. And in particular, they call attention to the impact this has, as you see here, on women and on young people. But I also want to focus today, when we talk about how it relates to students, on what is hidden by these statistics and what impact does this hiding have on Asian American students.
所以我今天呢，我要跟大家报告的就是，关于我们在过去这一段时间这个经历很多亚裔的暴力行为，有2方面。我们大家呢，大部分时候是专注在一些特殊的新闻或者是一些数字上面来看这件事情。所以第一方面就是我们经常会听到有很多事件是伤害老人，或者伤害女性，或者伤害孩童。然后呢，我们会听到很多数字，比如说在去年的3月7号以前发生多少事件，然后这些数字继续累积到几千个案件。所以我们今天要来洪老师会跟我们解释一下这些数字实际上代表的是什么。
So first, while I do feel it's important to talk about statistics, I think that oftentimes we focus on quantifying and sensationalizing individual acts of violence without a critique of systemic racism, a critique of the deep reasons as to why these acts of violence happen. For example, we don't talk about things like redlining, where in the 1940s and 50s, due to racist housing policies, neighborhoods in Philadelphia and in many urban areas became segregated, which led to racial tension, not just against Asian Americans, but other people of color.
所以今天我们洪老师先跟我们解释一下这个数字到底代表的是什么。OK， 我们经常听到一些数字呢，我们会把这些数字特别的专注，然后去扩大。好比说，在1940-50年的时候，在费城这个区域发生过很多这些种族歧视的事件。
Also, well, again, it is important to talk about statistics. I think oftentimes a focus on statistics can lead us to forget the names and the stories of those most impacted. So that oftentimes, like, we focus on the violence more than the people who are the victims of the violence, and in particular, the stories of the people. And so my hope is that when you hear the stories of the students and parents today, that we will challenge that.
所以专注在数字是没有错的，可是呢，很多时候我们太过专注在这个有些很大的数字上面，我们经常会忘记，实际上，在这些受害的人身上发生了对他们的伤害跟影响有哪些？我们也要专注在于他们所接受的暴力，或者是这些人的受害者的个人故事。
And so, again, I feel it is really important to listen to the stories of Asian Americans, the stories of people, as opposed to focusing on the violence itself. Because listening to these stories will help us understand the way that anti-Asian violence has impacted Asian American students and their families in different ways, but also our community as a whole.
我们为什么要来听这些人他们自己亲身的经验呢？是因为这样子才能够帮助我们，这些受害的人、这些学生跟他们的家人，在这个社区里面，生活上起了哪些改变？他们需要我们理解这一方面的背景。
Okay, I'm sorry, here we go. My apologies, I'm having trouble with the PowerPoint. If we are to focus on the individual stories of Asian Americans and also look at how these stories collectively have caused us to experience anti-Asian violence a certain way, I think it's really important to talk about trauma. Trauma, as this definition explains, it's not an event itself, but it's a response to a stressful experience in which a person's ability to cope is drastically undermined.
所以今天呢，我们要听这些个人的这些他们自己有过经验的人的个人的故事。我们需要专注在哪里呢？我们需要专注在于这些个人他们所受到的创伤。创伤不是只是发生的一件事件，创伤是影响到他们整个人，他们的对事情的反应，跟他们对这些压力的一个反应 ，OK， 还有他们自己本身的能力去怎么样来突破这个他们所受到的创伤。
And I would also add in my unofficial definition of trauma that trauma is an emotional injury that has long-lasting effects on our mental health. That in the same way, you know, I can have a back injury from 20 years ago, and then I can wake up just randomly with a backache. Trauma is something that is also long-lasting. And then finally, that the causes and effects of trauma take on different forms depending on who we are. We experience it differently. Based upon our race, our class, our gender, our sexual orientation, etc. So it's not about comparing. It's just about understanding and listening and being empathetic.
洪老师他也要跟我们分享他自己的对这个创伤的这件事情的定义。创伤是一个在你的情绪上的一个受伤，会在长远的影响到你的精神状况 ，OK， 你的精神健康，所以很多时候，这个就像是你如果20年前你伤了你的背，你20年以来每天早上醒来的时候，你的背都会痛，这是一个非常长远的，会留在你身上的一个情感上的创伤，还有他说。洪老师还提到的就是这个一个创伤的起因跟影响呢，是每一个人的经验都不一样的 ，OK， 就是要看每个人有不同的反应，这个是不能够 2个人或者很多人来比较的。
So, what impact does trauma have on the lives of Asian American students? Well, obviously, I think it's more important for us to listen to Asian American students, but I'm going to do my best to address what I feel are some important points to remember as we talk about this.
所以洪老师他要讨论的是，像这一类的创伤呢，对于我们亚裔的 OK 华人的学生是有哪些影响，哪些长远的影响？
Okay, so first thing, and again, I'm experiencing problems with my PowerPoint, so just please bear with me. I think it's important to realize that for a lot of Asian Americans, the trauma comes not just from experiencing an act of violence, but living with the fear, living with the threat of possibly being a victim of violence. APABA vote and APABA data recently did a study, and they showed that here, like they looked at different Asian American groups by ethnicity, and they asked, do you worry about experiencing hate crimes and harassment and discrimination because of COVID-19? And you can see here that a large percentage of Asian Americans said very often or somewhat often. Interestingly enough, I want to point out that the largest group with the highest percentage of feeling that they experience hate crimes and harassment were Asian Indians, based on this study. And why that is, I'm not really sure, but going back to my understanding of trauma, right? We have to remember that we're approaching the 20th anniversary of 9/11, and there are many people in the South Asian community who already have been experiencing, decades of like Islamophobia and racism because of the stereotypes and discrimination that came about after 9/11.
所以现在这个洪老师跟我们分享的这个图表啊，它上面是说，这个组织 APABA 他们所做的一个统计，就是从这个 COVID-19 疫情的亚裔的仇恨犯罪案件发生以来，在亚裔的人民里面，每一个不同的组织是大部分的人，不管是有很多不同的种族，可是大部分的人会感觉到，他们经常会感觉到会有受威胁，会害怕这些暴力的行为会发生在他们自己的身上。那所以他有一些不同的国家的人，第一个他们感觉到威胁最大的是亚裔的印度人，然后第二个种族呢是日本人，第三个是亚裔的美国人、菲律宾人、中国人、韩国人跟越南人。
So with that in mind, I feel from my experience as a teacher that for many of my Asian American students, the trauma lies in having to prove their pain. The trauma lies in having to explain how they're feeling and having to justify it, and having to prove that this is a threat and having to prove that we are in fear. And this is oftentimes where I think statistics don't fully explain everything. As an Asian American myself, I can't quantify, this, and I can't quantify, like how many times I've been harassed. And if I were to do that, I could be like, the numbers aren't going to like give justice to the way I feel. I may have had someone harass me one day, but I lived 365 days of my life in fear of that. And I think this is the case for many students.
所以洪老师跟大家解释的是说，就是对我们的这些亚裔的美国的亚裔的学生呢，他们这些创伤最大的困难是他们感觉到有需要来证实他们所受到的伤害，所以经常他们需要他们感觉到是非常困难， 来解释他们的感受，跟这个要来让大家理解他们这个受伤的程度，还要来证明他们是实际上他们有感觉到一些痛苦。这个洪老师他自己的经验呢，就是他自己也是亚裔，那他的感觉就是这个数字并不能够经常来代表我们所感受到的这种威胁、这种创伤、这些负面的感觉。因为如果他要说一年里面他有过一次很负面的经验的话，他并不能够证实他365天，其他的364天，他也是有身上带的心灵上带的是同样的感受。
Yeah, and I would just add that, I think in a lot of ways, this is the Asian American experience, right? That we always have to prove we exist, that our experiences matter. In a greater sense, I would say that this is the experience for many people of color. In the same way Black students have to prove that their experiences matter, Asian students go through things that are different yet similar.
所以洪老师他也要强调的就是说，这个是我们亚裔的人啊，是一个永远要经历的一种感受，就是我们总是要不停的要尝试的要来证实我们的生命是珍贵的，就像其他的不同的种族、少数民族，像黑人，他们也是，他们要发出声音来，让大家知道他们的生命也是很重要的。
My second point about trauma is that I feel that this trauma having to feel threatened and having to prove that we feel threatened has also caused and impacted our support networks and the support networks of Asian American students. To give you an example, this is Capitola Playground. Capitol Playground is a neighborhood playground not far from my house in South Philly. Now, for years now, this playground has been a gathering place for many Asian Americans, in particular Cantonese and Fujianese speaking Chinese Americans. And what happened was that early in the morning, a lot of elderly Asian Americans would come here and do Tai Chi. And then in the evenings, many would come back, and in particular, a lot of the grandmas would come and they would do different kinds of line dancing. And because Asian Americans are multi-generational, a lot of these elders, these grandparents, they would bring their kids and their grandkids that they were looking after. So the grandkids would all hang out and play on the playground equipment as the elders walked around and hung out and exercised. Now, I started coming here because I have two daughters who are Asian American, and my younger daughter, she got to know a couple doors down from us, another Asian American girl, and the Asian American girl's grandparents would come here to the park. And so we would all just come here in the evenings, and this became this real, great gathering place for all these Asian Americans, and a place for my kids to meet other Asian American kids and play with them.
所以现在这个洪老师跟我们分享的这个图片让我们看到一个非常生动的一个画面这个地方叫做 Capitol Playground， 就是一个公园 ，OK， 在南费城的一个公园。那这个公园的附近呢，有很多这个中国的居民，很多讲广东话的，或者是普通话的，跟福州话的。那他是说这个地方呢，因为我们中国人大部分都是有很多代一起居住，有很多老人呢早上喜欢来这里打太极拳，他们下午也很喜欢来这里，就是跳一点运动的舞，所以这个地方呢变成一个很多亚裔聚集的地方。那洪老师他自己有2个女儿， 他的小女儿呢，也经常会邀请他的一个邻居，他一个好朋友，大家来这个地方来玩，来聚集。
So what happened in March of 2020, as we all know, was our city went into lockdown. And this is what the playground looked like. And it was extremely eerie, right, to experience a year where this playground, which was the center of activity for so many Asian Americans, became this empty space. And it was even more striking when I noticed just walking around my neighborhood, right, that I didn't see any, even, people were stuck at home, but at least sometimes you would see people going outside and just exercising. I didn't see any Asian American people walking around. In fact, my neighbor's house, the windows were all drawn, and I honestly didn't know for several months if my neighbor, if they were still there. Well, what I want us to do is to think about like what impact that isolation had on so many Asian Americans, right? On elderly people who couldn't go outside and hang out, and kids like my children and my neighbor's children. But the other thing I want to point out is that, in the spring of this year, right, things started opening up again, and people started to go outside and congregate. And in my neighborhood, you saw people going and playing in the soccer fields in the park and hanging out in the bars around the playground. But Asian American people didn't come back. There were no Asian American people who came back. The elderly people didn't come back to the playground to do their calisthenics. And in doing so, they didn't bring their children and grandchildren with them. And I want to just kind of do some thinking about why. That for many Asian, okay, go ahead. Go ahead.
洪老师他刚才给我们看到的第二张照片是同一个公园，可是大家都看到完全是空的。那他跟我们分享的就是从2020年3月，我们这个就是这个 city OK， 我们大家都不出门，学校停学之后呢，大部分的公共场所都是空的。那这个公园本来是亚裔的华人呢，华人在这里聚集的一个非常好的一个休闲的场地，那大家都没有这样的机会。那他自己呢，他也注意到，就是他的邻居，他的四周围的他的街上有很多亚裔的人，他都没有看到他们都不从家里出来 ，OK， 大家都关在家里，害怕出门。洪老师他都不知道他们是不是还住在这些房子里。然后他也注意到有很多邻居呢，把这个窗门窗帘拉得紧紧的 ，OK， 完全跟外界隔绝。那大家可以想象这种，大家也可以分享这种你自己本身的经验，这种隔绝与外隔绝，因为你惧怕这种感觉是最不好的一种感觉。所以他也在想，就是像这些老人跟这些孩子都没有机会出门去做这些休闲的活动。他说今年春天我们也注意到，社会开放以后有一个很大的转变，大家也出来，也到这些公共场所，也回到公园来玩。可是呢，洪老师注意到的就是完全没有亚裔再来参与，所以也有很多一般的这些大众开始打球，开始出去喝酒休闲，可是呢，大部分的亚裔不愿意再出来。
So I think there are two major reasons for this. One is that a lot of Asian Americans just simply moved. There are so many Asian Americans who lost their places of employment, right? Many Asian Americans, work in the restaurant industry or have small businesses and had to leave, going to other parts of the country looking for other sources of employment. My younger daughter's friend actually was one of those people, where her mother found work in Colorado and they ended up moving there. my older daughter had a friend who moved to California in part to be with other family members, as well as because of the problems that her family was having with their restaurant. But beyond that, the other reason why I feel this happened was, again, the trauma, the fear. AAPI did a study that basically revealed that, for many Asian Americans, the fear of being a victim of a hate crime rivaled that of catching COVID. People weren't coming back just because they were concerned about catching COVID. They were not coming back because they were afraid of being blamed for COVID. And you can see some of these statistics that 50% of Asian Americans polled in the study reported feelings of anxiety. And in particular, you can see the impact that it has on young people. Like 1 in 3 Asian American young people reported feeling clinically elevated symptoms of depression or anxiety, and 1 in 4 AAPI young adults reported feeling PTSD. So what I want us to understand as we talk about the impact this has had on our communities and our students is that as Asian Americans, we are all experiencing this collective trauma from the loss of our communities and support systems. That in a lot of ways, as Asian Americans, individually and collectively, we are in a state of mourning. And we haven't been able to come out of this a good deal because, again, we are spending half of our time trying to even prove this is how we feel.
所以洪老师他的感觉呢，就是为什么大家不出来呢？也有2个原因，2个主要的原因。第一个原因是我们亚裔华人 ，OK， 有大部分人都是做餐馆这一方面的职业。那在这个疫情这一段时间当中呢，很多餐馆关门，或者是大家把工作失去了工作，所以为了生活，他们一定要搬走，要搬到别的地方去发展。他自己的女儿，他的小女儿的朋友搬到 Colorado， 他的大女儿的朋友搬到加州，这些都是因为他们的父母亲需要搬离开我们这个城市，去寻找他们自己的生活。那另外一个原因呢，也是主要的原因，就是这个创伤，我们经过这个疫情的时期的这些歧视，造成了等于是我们的整个文化的社区的人，大家都感觉到一个共同的一个创伤，就是我们不愿意出来到公共场所，因为我们又是回到这个亚裔，总是需要能够要来证明我们本身的价值。OK， 那很多亚裔的现在的感觉就是我们是不受欢迎的，我们需要来证实我们的自己的价值，我们生命的价值。
Okay, I'm sorry, I need to, I'm having trouble with my PowerPoint. I'm gonna need to just exit out of it, I'll go back.
所以黄老师把他的这个图片整理一下。
Okay, sorry about that. So what can schools do to address anti-Asian violence? Well, if we keep this all in mind, okay, you know what? I'm really sorry, but the slides don't seem to be working as I had intended. So if it's okay, I'm just going to show my screen this way. Is that all right?
Yeah.
Okay. So the first thing is that I think schools need to understand that the issue isn't simply that violence happened or could happen in school. It's about the role that schools play in addressing it. And in particular, that the responsibility of schools needs to extend beyond the school building. I say that first of all, because as I've been saying, that the lives of our students, and the feelings of trauma that many of our students feel exist for 24 hours of the day, not just between 8 and 3 o'clock while they're in the building. Secondly, because that for a lot of Asian American students, that fear is intensified, in particularly on the way to and from school. There have been incidents of students being harassed on SEPTA. And so schools need to think holistically about their responsibility to Asian American students, both in and outside the building.
所以现在我们来回到我们今天的主题 ，OK， 就是亚裔的学生他们所受到的受到的影响，他们的感受。第一点呢，就是我们要专注的不是只是种族歧视这件事情，我们要专注的是学校他们所应该要采取的这些教育的人员应该要采取的一个态度，他们的角色是什么？学生他们所感受到的这个恐惧感 ，OK， 不是只是在学校里面，这个延伸到除了学校之外的生活 ，OK， 有很多这些学生呢，他们的这种感受，他们的感受到恐惧，他们感受到被歧视，这种感觉是跟着他们24个小时的，也不是只是在学校里面跟同学之间的一些摩擦，也包括了比如说他们去上学的时候，或者是回家的路上，他们坐在 SEPTA 的 bus 或者是地铁上面，他们会经历哪些事情，哪些不好的经验。
Okay, I'm going to try doing full screen again. Hopefully I fix the problem. Okay, secondly, schools need to listen and be accountable to Asian American students. Students shouldn't have to prove that they're in pain. Schools need to listen. I know there are many educators who oftentimes feel like, oh, you know, I don't want to like talk about anti-Asian violence or racism. I don't want to hurt the feelings of students or make them feel uncomfortable. The issue isn't that Asian American students do not want to talk about racism. The issue is that many educators don't want to listen.
所以洪老师他要强调的就是，我们现在要怎么样能够让学校知道他们应该要怎么样来帮助我们的学生。第一个重点呢，就是他们需要听我们的学生的意见，听我们亚裔学生的孩子的意见，他们也要对他们负责任。有很多老师、很多教育人员呢，他们感觉到说，这不是一个很容易主动提出来的一个题材，他们很多时候他们不愿意主动的跟这些亚裔的学生来沟通 ，OK？ 可是并不是这些亚裔学生不愿意讨论，而是他们真的是他们觉得没有人真的是很认真的聆听他们的心声。
Third, schools need to recognize the diversity of Asian American student lives and how they experience and address trauma. Schools need to understand that Asian Americans are not a monolith, that we all experience and address racial trauma differently, depending on who we are, depending on our ethnicity, our gender, our age, our religion, our sexual orientation, if we have a disability. The other thing is, for Asian American students, I think that educators should also just understand that diversity also extends to when we are silent, that there is not just one reason why a student might be silent. That student might not want to say something, or that student might not feel ready to say something, or that student might have an issue with, English proficiency. That we need to just understand that we all also express silence in different ways. There tends to be this, misconception that if Asian American students are silent, it's just like, okay, they can't speak English or something. And there's many different reasons.
这个学校他们先要能够认取的一件事情就是，亚裔的学生跟所有的学生是一样的，我们是多元化的，我们不是大家都是一样的 ，OK？ 我们不是一个整体的一个个体，每一个学生他们有他们自己的性格，有他们自己的理由。为什么他们沉默呢？也许是因为他们的语言有困难，也许是因为他们背景，就像所有的学生的背景有很多不同的国籍、不同的文化、不同的性向 ，OK， 不同的性格，所以 学校要能够把这些亚裔的学生，真正能够对他们每一个个体有足够的了解。
All right, next, I think schools should realize that International Day is not a solution to the problems and issues of anti-Asian violence. Asian American studies can be a solution. Culturally responsive mental health services can be a solution, but not International Day. A lot of schools, what they'll do is, to try to recognize Asian students, is they'll have some kind of like a festival where they'll have students, wear, what they deem to be appropriate ethnic garb and cook different kinds of Asian foods or do different kinds of performances. And, there's nothing wrong with doing that if students want to do that. But we fail to realize that a lot of times this can actually create more trauma for Asian American students, many of whom may not fully understand or or are in the process of trying to understand what culture means to them. And so, oftentimes Asian Americans, we are expected to have to be the ones educating, entertaining, and International Day oftentimes is seen as a quick fix, but it is not an answer. It's akin to telling somebody, whose parent dies, okay, by making you feel better, here, cook for us. It is not a solution. There are many other more appropriate solutions that would address trauma.
所以洪老师他所提出来的这件事情呢，我想大家都有相同的感受，就是学校他们当然他们有一些庆祝的活动，像每年有一个国际日，让每一个国家的学生呢能够来做一些表演，然后也许是带一些食物，这个变成一种消闲的一个活动，这是非常肤浅的一个代表。这个并不能够帮助我们亚裔的学生感受到他们是这个成员里面的一部分。可是什么是重要的呢？洪老师他提出来的是，比如说有一门课叫做亚裔美国人的一个研究的一个课，或者是在这个精神辅导这一方面，能够融入这个学生他们自己的背景文化的，这两个方面是真正对这些学生的问题能够有帮助的。OK， 一年一次来举办一个活动，大家来开一个派对，这样子表演什么的，或者是你想要让别人觉得你很在意他的文化，就请他来带一些食物来给你吃，这个都是非常表面性的。
Next, I think it's really important that schools need to support student and parent organizing, which is what our speakers forthcoming are going to talk about. And we need to recognize and celebrate this. For example, some of you may have heard that back in 2009 at South Philly High, there were acts of violence perpetrated against Asian American students there. But what I think is really important, again, to realize is it's not the violence itself. It's what students did about this. And what students did was they organized. They organized with other students, Black, white, brown students, and they pressured the school to be accountable to allowing this climate where violence happened in the school. And in doing so, they got the school to develop the anti-bullying policies that we have today that other speakers are going to talk about. And also they got the Department of Justice to affirm that their rights were violated. And even more importantly, that some of these students are now leaders today in the Asian American community who are now giving back to a new generation of Asian American student leaders. Finally, what I want to say is, I'm in this sticky thing again, sorry about that. That in doing this, that schools need to recognize that we as Asian Americans in general, we have the solutions. We are the bearers of the solutions. To give another example, I can say at my school, 20 years ago, there was a spate of hate crimes against Asian Americans, where Asian Americans are being harassed. Where food was being thrown at them in the cafeteria. And similarly to what happened in South Philly, students organized and they demanded that the school be accountable. And their actions led to Central High School developing a Mandarin program. They led to Central High School hiring Asian American teachers, and for over a decade, for the school having bilingual counselors and also an Asian American studies class. I owe my job at Central to the organizing that students did. And so with that in mind, with this understanding that students have the solution, I want to turn things over to the students now. Thank you.
所以洪老师他刚才所提出来的是要这个学校呢需要理解的是，他们应该要支持学生跟家长表达他们的意见 ，OK？ 他们应该要支持亚裔的学生跟家长能够来举办活动，他们能够来组织一些让别人能够理解他的机会。他提到就是在2009年那个南费城的高中，他们举办过这样一个活动，因为那个时候有一些这些歧视的案件，然后他自己的经验呢，他是说20年前，就在中央高中也是发生过一些这个歧视亚裔的案件，大家举办了这个活动来宣导了以后呢，让学校能够理解说，我们应该要怎么样来支持这个亚裔的这些学生，他们开始教一个中文的课，然后也雇了一些懂2种双语的中文、英文的一些辅导员。那洪老师他跟大家分享的就是他自己本身，他也是因为这一件事情他受益了，他能够得到这个工作，来中央高中为大家服务。所以他还要提醒的就是学校需要理解的是，我们自己亚裔的这个社区呢，我们能够提出一些解决的方式，是需要他们来聆听。那现在他把这个讲台交给他的学生。
Okay, thank you for Mr. Hung for everything, and appreciate Agnes. Really, if you want to stop me at any time. So really appreciate the work that you're doing. But I think that to really start about the student perspective, I really want to talk about how more than 1 year of racist attacks and the harassment that was stoked by pandemic racism, it has brought kind of this new founded political visibility to the persistence of anti-Asian racism, right? This is something that's not new. And then yet a lot of these popular framings hide the institutional and international roots of anti-Asian violence in favor of this problematic vision of only quote unquote raising awareness to combat individual prejudice, right? It's not solving anything.
所以00呢，他提出一个非常好的一个重点啊，就是我们所要来倡导的，不是只是要大家出声，让别人听到我们 ，OK？ 我们所需要追求的一个重点，我们是要能够在政治上让大家听到我们的意见，让大家来给我们一个舞台，是不是？这就是光是一个个人的案件，能够来提高大家的警觉性，这不是足够的。
And then I really want to talk about how, in the midst of all this, as a high school student in Philadelphia, Jaira and Aleena, it's sort of difficult for us to grasp that we are advocating for a community while still being a kid, right? And yet, because of that, I think that we all have a special responsibility, especially a special responsibility to people before us, the people now, that we must stand with them in the struggle because we want a better world for the future and for people who are going after me, right?
玲玲她提出的非常重要的一点就是，现在呢是一个很困难的一个时期，现在是8月快要开学了，玲玲她自己本身她是这样一个年轻的一个孩子，她的最主要的身份是一个学生，可是她站起来帮助她自己的社区做一个倡导的人的一个地位。这不是很容易的一件事情，我们大家可以想象，这是非常困难的。他是一个非常勇敢的一个孩子，那他的目标呢，也是要能够代表不光是他自己这一代，他要代表在他以前的我们社区里面的人，也希望能够改变一些政治上的气氛，我们能够达到一些目标，能够帮我们之后的人能够铺出一条路。
And then I think that right now talking about like anti-Asian violence in schools is something that's very hard to really talk about because it's so subtle, right? It takes a long time for us to really be like, oh, was that racist? Was that really kind of messed up that you said that to me, right? And I think that before we went into quarantine, I remember people debating with me about how calling COVID-19 the Chinese virus was justified in a medical sense. I remember people when Piers and I were harassed on our trip going and leaving schools, people were like, that didn't happen, right? And I think that it was something very important when like students were able to have the courage to start reporting it to the main office about the trauma, but then the responses weren't what we expected.
玲玲她跟我们分享的就是在过去这1年多的时间当中，就是这个学校停学之后，在那一段时间呢，政府 OK 有很多重要的人把这个 COVID 这个疫情称呼成一个中国的一个疫苗，一个中国的一个病毒。像这一类的侮辱性的这些言谈是非常对，不管是对大家来说，还是特别是对年轻的孩子来说，是一个非常非常困难的一个话题。他们很多时候呢，这些学生的感受是他不知道他是不是应该把他的感受提出来，因为这些是有很多这种歧视的这种影射是影射性的 ，OK， 并不是在表面上的，所以他们不知道要用什么样的方式来表达他们自己。可是他要强调的一点就是，我们要有勇气，能够把这个话题提出来。在我们感觉到我们被别人压迫、歧视的时候，我们要能够把这个话题打开来，让大家来讨论。
But I think that one thing that really that didn't encourage folks to speak out is when like, oh, the main office, they said comments like, sorry, can't do anything about it. Not enough traumatized kids are reporting it. So we are going to just think that nothing is happening, right? And then I remember someone told me that they added a comment where they said that, oh, I am seeing it on the news. So it's happening, but I don't know if it's happening to you and happening to our students in the school. And I think that this comment, I think that they added it so in a way to be like, oh, we're not gaslighting you that this isn't happening because we see it happening in the news, right? But I think that the way they said it, it was very ironic because then it created this message of like, we cannot trust you. Like if I have to trust anyone, I can trust myself and I can trust my peers, but I cannot trust you.
所以这个玲玲的感受就是，他比如说事情刚开始发生，他去跟学校报告的时候呢，比如说他到办公室，他去报告他们发生了这些事情，要不然他得到的反应就是很抱歉，这我不能替你做什么，或者是有些人态度就是说，哦，有这样的事情发生吗？我在新闻上有看到，我完全不知道也发生在你身上 ，OK？ 所以这些过程当中呢，就是需要有很多勇气来处理这样的状况。
And I think that with this fear, as someone who like I'm 17 now, right? But then I think that when I was like 16, when I was 15, I dealt with these kinds of harassment. I can't blame myself for like, oh, I couldn't reach out to you, right? I wasn't one of the kids with that courage to like come talk to you and be like, oh yeah, I was harassed on the bus and I went home today, right? And I think that this is something very important. Is like, oh, that's when students started talking, right? Students are the reasons why I do the work that I do. Students always show up for each other, right?
所以他说的就是这个学生所感觉到的这种恐惧感，就是不知道是不是应该要报告，不知道要怎么样表达他们自己。他今年是17岁了，他说他回想到去年他16岁的时候，他经常不知道要用什么样的恰当的方式能够来表达他的意见，能够让别人知道他所说的是实在重要的事情。
And I think that sometimes it also happens in a curriculum base. This is not something just, oh, we deal with outside harassment. It's also something that we are being taught, especially in a classroom full of majority of Asian people. We are taught in history that the wars that we caused in Asia, that was justified because those were bad Asians over there. And the only difference that sets you apart is that you are good Asians and you are here, right? And I think that really traumatized a lot of people because then it's like, oh, I'm trying my best to be seen as someone who belongs here. I'm trying my best to be respectable. I'm trying my best. Oh, I've been in the school district for like 13 years now, so I am respected and I can speak English well. And I think that kind of caused a rift between our own communities, right? Being like, we have to prove our best to the system, so then the system can like protect me and can respect me in the future, right? And I think that that's something that a lot of children are still dealing with, and it's a form of trauma that I think lives with us, right? And it's something that's very hard to get rid of. And I hope that it's something that is acknowledged.
还有就是这些他们的这种感受，这种非常复杂的感受呢，不光是在跟他们的这个同学之间的关系里面，经常在教室里面，比如说在一个历史课，他们教学的时候，学到一些这个教材里面包括一些这个亚洲的历史，然后这个其中也会引起很多的这个矛盾，就是 OK， 有哪些亚洲人是好的亚洲人，有哪些是坏的亚洲人，或者是在学生他们亚裔的学生他们的团体中间呢，有些人觉得说，哦，我从小在这边长大，我在这个学区里面上学上了13年了，我英文讲得很好，我跟你不一样，所以这个也会引起他们这个本身学生社区之间的一种内部的一些问题。他们所需要的，他们需要学校能够做到的，就是学校要能够保护他们，尊重他们。
And I really want to talk about how like these form of traumas really made me feel like, oh, I need to act now, right? I can't wait for someone to act for me. So I think that when it all started, and I'm speaking for myself, when I experienced the first stirrings of like a commitment to liberation was the summer of 2020, right? At that time, I was simply aspiring to do everything that I could to give my talents and my energy to the cause of my people, right? I remember meeting Jaira, Aleena, and the rest of our friends on Zoom, talking about problems that were present in our schools. And I remember that we were talking for 2 to 3 hours every day, planning, talking, writing things. And I remember we lost our voice for a couple of days after that. And I think that at that time we recognized that, oh, so our lives and the lives of our families, our friends have really been drastically transformed over the last year. And then you can imagine how hard it is when we went back to school that year and be like, oh, we have to organize while also in mourning because we are looking in TV and all these like news and being like, oh, looking at these losses of human life of people who look like us, right?
还有就是这个创伤这个本身 ，OK， 我们是要怎么样用什么样的方式来克服它？这个是一个非常长远的一个复杂的一个程序。像玲玲她自己本身呢，她在学校跟其他的学生组织起来，他们办一些活动，他们讨论。他记得有很多经验，就是跟他的好朋友讨论这些事情，讨论到后来讲话声音都讲不出来。 可是他有很大的意愿要把他自己的才能跟他的经历 OK 贡献出来，能够改变一些事情。
And I think that to really like conclude, I think that as students, we only have a couple of options. We must like continue to learn about our histories that are through our perspective, through the radical perspective, and the way that our oppression manifests in our lives. But then we are also looking at the joy that comes from our identities.
所以他是说，以他们学生的角度来看呢，他们自己也有一些选择 ，OK， 就是他们需要理解他们自己的，我们这个华人自己的历史 ，OK， 我们是经过了哪些过程达到今天的，还有就是我们在过去所受到的压迫，这个压迫的过程，然后从这个压迫的过程里面演变到今天的局面，这些都是一些历史的角度我们需要理解的。那还有呢，很重要的就是一个乐观的角度，就是我们要提醒我们自己，我们从这个过程当中，我们走到今天这一步，这个之间也得到了很大的喜乐。
And I think that this like tiny step is extremely hard because even in our own high school, we don't even have access to our own history again. Asian American history is just not prioritized, even in the school where majority of the population is of Asian descent. And this is why like when we go back to school and on August 31st, we are writing a syllabus of our own and we are teaching each other of the people and the events that come before us. If we feel like the system cannot do it for us, then we have to do it ourselves.
所以这是非常重要的一点，就是他们在中央高中 OK， 这是一个亚裔的学生非常非常数字非常高的一个学校，可是在这样一个环境里，他们都没有学习的机会来学习，就是学习他们华裔的学生自己本身或者是一般的学生没有机会去学习这个美国华裔的历史 OK， 所以呢他的看法就是，如果学校不能够提供这个给大家的话，他们可以自己来提供，来把这个推广，把这个华人的美国华裔的历史来推广。
And I really want to emphasize that it's a way to really build dignity within ourselves when there are so many instances of dehumanization in like our present time and in history, right? And I think that our desire to tell these stories do not ever go away, no matter how hard the school curriculum tries to whitewash it.
所以这是非常佩服玲玲。她说很重要的一点就是我们大家要能够建立起一个我们自己本身的一个尊严 ，OK？ 我们先要来尊重我们的历史，我们才能够把我们的历史广泛的推展给别人 ，OK？ 所以这个是他希望能够有机会做到。
Yeah, and to really end, I really want to also emphasize that as youth, we will always try to listen to elders and mentors in our communities, because they are able to have wisdoms that we often don't have, right? Like Mr. Hung, like Anna, like Agnes, you guys have a lot of wisdom that we don't often have in our like short time here. And I think that that's one crucial thing that we really believe in. And it's also to also question the things that we often take for granted, right? So much of what we assume to be true is inherited from systems of power that continues to silence us.
所以还有就是这也是我们历史背景的一部分。这些华裔的孩子呢，他们对于年长的人，对他们的老师非常非常尊重。玲玲自己本身，她也非常感谢她的生命里面有像 Anna， 有像洪老师这样子的人能够带领她、支持她，所以这些也是她希望别人能够对我们的文化背景有理解的。
And to kind of end it off, I think that the most important step for us, especially young people, old people, all Asian people, one of the things that we need to actively tackle is to always take care of ourselves. I think that we need a culture of care if we are going to continually fight for justice, right? We can always feel this passion, but if we are not taking care of ourselves, it's going to be very short term. It's not going to be a long-term movement. And I hope that community members who are listening right now continue to support us, continue to support local communities, because we really need it. I think it's important to create a collective effort to fight against oppressive forces, especially anti-Asian violence. And I really want to emphasize that with youth leading the way.
所以玲玲她要强调的，她就是最后她要做一个总结，她要强调的就是最重要的一点，就是我们希望能够让社会的主流能够理解我们，能够接受我们的之前呢，我们要做好的，我们要先要做到的是要能够照顾好我们自己，我们自己的社区，我们自己本身 ，OK， 就是在这个比如说社区里面，我们这个我们这个区域的这一群人，大家能够把我们的精力组织起来，然后希望能够像对这些暴力的这些事件或者是歧视的事件呢，能够有一个总结的一个力量，能够让这个效果是长远的。
That's it. Now I would like to transition to Jaira.
Actually, I needed to step in real quick just because our time is stretched out longer than we had originally planned. For purposes of CLE credit, I'm going to run both polls now. So anyone who would like to request Pennsylvania CLE credit, please answer the poll questions. And in fact, anyone can answer them. It's not limited, but I'm going to run them right now. So I started the first poll question.
所以这样他要提醒大家，因为我们时间的现在很长了啊，所以他要把那个，如果你需要宾州那个法律这个课程的学分的话，他有一些问题，刚才在那个荧幕上有出来的，他现在把第二个问题也提出来，请你回答。
And I'm going to give it a little bit of time for that, and then I'll run the next poll question.
所以给大家几分钟的时间啊。
Jung, a participant says they can't see the poll question. Do others see it?
I have 77%
有些人说看不
participants
到这个问题。
voted. If you can't see the poll questions, do get in contact with me if you need your CLE credits. The poll question is, do you have school-aged children? And if so, are you concerned about their safety at school or on the commute to and from school? And the choices are no, I do not have school-aged children. Yes, I have school-aged children, but I am not concerned. Or yes, I have school-aged children and I am concerned about their safety at school or on the commute to and from school. So
所以这个这样他跟大家分享这个问题是，你有没有上就是在学龄的孩子有还是没有？或者是如果你有的话，你担不担心他们就是去上学跟回家的路程上有什么安全的威胁？
all right, I am going to end this poll and start the next poll. And I hope you can see this, but the question is, are you aware of the language access policy for your local school district? And it's a simple yes or no question.
所以这个问题是说，你知不知道你的附近的学区有没有这个语言的这个条例哦？
And I just wanted to say, I know we had originally scheduled this for a 1.5 hour CLE credit. As long as you stay for the 1.5 hours, you will get the CLE credit, even though I think our program is going to stretch longer than we had originally contemplated, because the interpretation we had planned for it to be simultaneous, but obviously that that didn't happen. So it's going to be, the program is going to run longer than originally planned.
所以这样他跟大家解释一下，就是因为我们今天的时间会超过1个半小时，所以如果你需要这个学分的话，你只要能够听到1个半小时结束，你就会拿到这个学分啊。我们今天时间因为这个翻译的关系，所以延长了。
Okay, I'm going to close this poll. If you have any trouble accessing it, get in contact with me and we'll work it out.
OK， 所以现在我们继续啊。如果你问题没有回答，有其他的话，请你跟他联系。
Okay, I'm going to hand it over to, I think, Jaira. Yeah, go ahead.
我们现在请 Jaira 跟我们表达一下她的意见。
It's actually me. So hi everyone. I'm Aleena. I just want to say thank you to all the panelists who spoke so far, and thank you to Agnes for translating. So I'm gonna begin now.
我们现在啊，实际上现在是轮到 Aleena Tan 她要帮我们演讲一下，非常感谢大家来参加，感谢这些讲员。Go ahead.
So racial discrimination against Asians has been so normalized that we often overlook it and don't even realize it's happening. Specifically in school, it happens to parents, teachers, and students.
所以这个 Aleena 她跟大家分享的，她是说，这个对亚裔的歧视已经是大家都习以为常的一回事 ，OK？ 所以很多时候呢，也就不谈了，也就不提出来了。可是这个对不管是家长、学生还是老师来讲，都是很重要的。
When there's report card conferences, parents are encouraged to come to hear about how their children are doing in their classes. However, most Asian parents work long hours and can't attend these meetings even if they want to. Thus, they don't know what's going on with their children and are kept on the outside.
他提出的一个很明显的一件事情就是，每一次就是发成绩单的时候 ，OK， 学校会邀请家长进去跟老师讨论一下你的孩子的进度。可是呢，大部分的亚裔的家长都是工作时间非常非常长，他们没有办法请假到学校去开这个会议，所以很多时候家长对他的孩子在学校的一些问题或者表现的话，并不是知道的很清楚。
This causes a lack of teacher and parent connection, which is a disadvantage for the kid. Even during the pandemic, when it was a time for growth, there was still a lot of racial discrimination taking place. When the school district was planning to make students go back to school, they didn't involve a lot of Asian parents.
所以他是说，这也是一个很重要的一个原因，就是亚裔的家庭呢，家长跟老师之间，接触的机会非常少，他们之间不是有很多的理解 ，OK？ 所以就连在疫情发生之前，这个亚裔的歧视的问题，在学校也是一个很严重的问题。
The parents were all confused and didn't really understand what was happening. The translations weren't good, so parents were still kept out of the loop. Though their children were the ones being directly impacted, they still weren't properly informed about the actions that the school district would impose.
所以，尤其是这个疫情发生了以后呢，家长并不能够理解这个程序上学区的计划，或者是一些发表的，他们因为语言的问题不能够阅读，然后经常这个翻译的就算有翻译的文字的话，也是非常有限的，或者是大部分的时候根本就没有翻译的机会，所以很多家长。不光是经历他们自己的压力，他们自己的这个困惑 ，OK， 他们尤其在疫情这段时间，对于他们的孩子学校那一方面的学习方面的理解是非常非常有限的。
Schools need to be more considerate of Asian parents and involve them in the community. They need to reach out to more parents and take these teacher-parent-student relationships more seriously.
所以 Aleena 她所要提出来的要求是学校应该要特别要加重这个亚裔的父母跟老师之间的接触 ，OK 之间的沟通，尤其是在这个停学复学这个过程当中呢，他们需要能够有更多的理解。
Usually, if a kid is struggling in school, they don't tell their parents because they don't want to upset them. They don't tell them if they're having trouble focusing or keeping up in their grades in class and deal with racist slurs thrown at them. This causes isolation for students.
还有很明显的就是，孩子在学校成绩不好的时候，或者是他在学校经历很多困难的时候，很自然的就是孩子不愿意让父母亲知道 ，OK？ 那这个状况呢，不光是造成了他们的更多的困难，也会引起更多他们那种被隔绝的感觉。
This causes isolation for students. They feel as if they have to deal with all of their issues alone, that there's no one there to help them and support them. I think that the reason why we try to deal with all of our problems on our own is because we don't want to give our parents more to worry about. They work all day and week, so we know that they're stressed and tired.
所以像这些亚裔学生一个共同的问题就是，他们在学校他们有困难的时候，或者是他们成绩学习方面表现不好的时候，他们不愿意，很自然的不愿意告诉他们的父母亲，因为他们知道他们的父母亲每天的工作时间非常长 ，OK， 他们父母亲承受很大的压力，已经是不能够再担心更多的事情。可是呢，这样的状况引起到这些孩子身上承担更大的压力。他们更感觉到被隔绝，他们觉得他们生活里面、生命里面所有的问题，都要这些孩子自己一个人承担。
We also don't want to shatter their American dream for our parents since they have worked so hard to come to America and build a life for themselves. They left the rest of their family in their home country since they have heard about all of the great opportunities that America had to offer. To hear their children still having to deal with discrimination at school, where it's supposed to be a safe space for students to learn, will break their hearts.
Aleena 她提到一个非常重要的一点，就是这些亚裔的孩子，他们不光是要面对社会里面带来的问题，学校里面带来的困难，他们也非常理解他们的父母亲呢，这些新移民来到美国这个国家，他们每一个人都有自己的美国的梦 ，OK？ 他们希望他们的孩子能够得到比他们本身得到更好的待遇。所以对他们来说呢，如果他们知道他们的孩子在学校这样子挣扎，经历很多困难，然后并没有达到他们梦想里的那些目标的话呢，他们真的是对他们来讲是很难承受的。
I know that I tend to not tell my parents what's happening with me since I don't know how to explain it to them and don't want them to worry. As Asian children, we try to shield our parents from all the cruel things in the world, like they try to shield us. I think this needs to change. In order for all of us to heal our pain, we need to be more open so that we can all help and support each other.
非常重要的就是，因为在孩子那一方面呢，他们不愿意让父母担心，所以他们不分享他们的困难。父母这一方面呢，也不愿意让孩子承担他们自己的压力，所以这个之间的关系就越来越隔绝。这个是非常重要的，就是双方面能够得到足够的帮助，能够帮助他们化解这些沟通上的困难。他自己的经验 ，Aleena 自己的经验是，他的感觉就是，他如果有什么好消息，他要让他父母亲高兴。可是如果说没有好消息的时候，他不愿意跟父母分享，让他们担心。他们父母给孩子的看到的也是都是生命里面正面的那一面 ，OK？ 这个是需要改变的。
It makes me sad to think about how most Asian children have to deal with racism at such a young age. I think everyone has had an experience where they were discriminated against that they can vividly remember. Me and a lot of people that I know have experienced racism in middle school.
他是让他觉得非常感伤的一件事情啊，就是有那么多，包括他自己本身有那么多年轻的孩子，年纪很小的孩子，都需要经历这种种族歧视的这样的事件，让他觉得非常感伤。OK， 这是不应该发生的事情。
I remember one day my friend made a joke and I laughed, and he called me a chink because of how my eyes looked. The rest of the friend group laughed and started saying it too. I laughed because I didn't understand. However, when I learned how offensive the word was, I felt uncomfortable, but at the same time, I didn't know what to do.
他自己本身有这样一个经验，我想很多人都有这样的经验。他跟他朋友在那边聊天 ，OK， 大家开玩笑。他就是其中的一个朋友叫他 chink， 用这个字眼来称呼他，因为他的眼睛的形状。他当时呢，他不知道怎么样反应，他也不是非常理解这个字的侮辱的性质，所以他就跟着别人一起笑。OK， 他知道有很多别的孩子也是有同样的经验。
As we get older, the racial remarks are more subtle, though they still hold a lot of harm. Racism has now become more institutionalized. Like in school, racism comes in forms of not overcoming these language barriers, not having enough Asian counselors and teachers, not having enough resources for low-income schools, and so much more.
所以他的感觉是像这些歧视的这种种族歧视的这些例子啊。这孩子长大了以后呢，慢慢这些变成性质不一样，变得比较隐藏性 ，OK， 所以对于很多孩子来说是更难诠释的一件事情。可是，在他们有这种困惑的时候呢，他的感觉是学校没有足够的能够说中文的双语的老师跟辅导员来帮助他们。
Before lockdown, students were harassed to and from school due to racial stereotypes around COVID. And though many expressed their concerns to the administration, they didn't do anything that made Asian students feel more safe. This made a lot of students lose their trust for the school that was supposed to fight for them. I know a lot of my friends and family got harassed during this time. It caused a lot of fear and unsteadiness.
他说，在这个疫情停学以前啊，已经是有很多这样的例子，就是学生在去上学跟放学的路上，在这个车程当中，被人家开玩笑，被人家叫这些名字，很多这些种族歧视的这些事件，他们跟学校报告的时候呢，学校并没有采取行动。因为这个原因呢，让这些亚裔的学生对学校里面的这些工作人员失去了信心，他们觉得没有人能够帮助他们。
One of my friends got yelled at when walking home and was told to go back to their country. There was another friend that got stares and dirty looks on the bus and was not able to get a seat because people didn't want to be around them. I got so scared for them that I made them share their location so that I could make sure they were safe.
他说他有2个朋友，一个朋友呢有这个经验，就是别人跟他们说，你回到你自己的国家去。OK， 就是在这个疫情当中，然后另外一个朋友呢，坐在交通工具上，然后四周围没有人愿意离他近，因为他们觉得他有被传染的可能性。所以像这些例子，真的对这些学生来说是非常难处理的。
I find it so absurd that we had to look out for ourselves and our friends because we had no one else looking out for us. When will there be someone that fights for us, protects us, and values us? If America values education so much, why does it have to be so difficult for the children to obtain a proper one? I hope that students, parents, and staff get more assistance and that we become a more united community. The youth have led the way for so long and we have fought it for ourselves, but at the end of the day, we need support and we need people to back us up.
他觉得这是非常无稽的一件事情，就是这些孩子，他们是在学习的过程当中，他们是去学校接受教育，可是这些孩子呢，他们没有人能够帮助他们，他们除了在学习之外，他们还需要来在这样的状况下保护他们自己。他觉得这是实在是非常无稽的一件事情。他要求学校这些做教育的人能够聆听他们的声音，能够知道他们的感受，能够来采取行动，来帮助他们度过这些难关。这些不应该是这些学生跟这些孩子要独立来战斗的一件事情。
Okay, that's all. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Jaira, and I'll be going next. I just want to say thank you for this opportunity to talk. So during COVID, I grew to become fearful of not only for myself, but for the people around me, specifically my parents who both work in the medical field. I remember how my parents would warn me about going out, and by going out, I mean like walking around my neighborhood. They weren't warning me about just the virus, but other people. COVID was at its climax, and Asian hate crime rates were skyrocketing. My parents would always tell me to be careful, but then I think in my head, what about your safety?
Jaira 他跟大家分享的就是他说这个疫情的这个过程当中，他的父母亲2个人都是医疗人员 ，OK？ 他说刚开始的时候呢，状况很不好的时候，他的父母亲经常提醒他说，你要非常非常小心。你要格外的小心，因为不光是因为这个疫情的事件，那个数字一直在上升，你也要非常小心对于这个亚洲人歧视的这件事情。
Even though my parents and many medical staff are important heroes in the fact that they are risking their lives to help patients, they're being held back because of one thing. They're from Asian descent. That their scrubs were like a target rather than a sign of heroism. It completely baffled me whenever I heard on the news that Asian medical staff were looked down upon just because people connected COVID to Asians. People completely disregarded their hard work, their sacrifices, and their lives, which were put on the line to help people with this deadly disease.
所以虽然他的父母亲2个人都是医疗的人士 ，OK， 在这个疫情的当中，我们大家都听到，新闻上这个广集的大众称呼这些医疗人员都是英雄 ，OK， 大家非常非常感谢他们，非常珍惜他们的服务。可是呢 ，Jaira 他的父母2个人，虽然他们是医护人员，可是他们也是亚洲人，所以在他的感觉就是，他们不但要做这一份非常困难的工作，他们还是要同时的要担心这个被歧视的这件问题。
I remember bringing this up amongst my friends, and they would tell me they shared similar feelings. They're scared for their friends, for their siblings, for their parents, for their grandparents. My community was frozen in fear. Not only that, but my community is faced with another issue. They're going against their own people. For years, we were set up to go against other minorities because of model minority myth. But on top of that, COVID has created division between different ethnic groups within the community. Some people would try to separate themselves from Chinese people because of their direct correlation to COVID. However, the coronavirus doesn't discriminate, people do.
所以他也观察到一件非常重要的一个现象，就是在亚裔的这个团体里面、社区里面我们有很多不同国籍的人。他注意到，就是在这个疫情的这个过程当中呢，光是在亚裔的团体里面，大家也开始有很多分裂的现象，因为 因为我们这个疫情被称呼成中国的这个病毒，对不对？所以有很多其他国籍的亚洲人也要特别的，也是一种内部的一种歧视，他们要让别人知道说我不是中国人 ，OK， 这个也造成了很多内部的歧视。
As a Filipino, and especially someone who doesn't look East Asian passing at all, I don't experience the same hate that my East Asian friends and family experience. I also want to clarify that this isn't meant to belittle other Filipinos or Southeast Asians and their experience with COVID, but rather address how hate can come in different forms. Hate came to me through fear for my friends going to and from school. Hate came to me through fear of my parents working at clinics and hospitals. Hate came to me through fear that the people in my community would drift away.
所以他自己本身 Jaira 他自己本身他是菲律宾裔的一个孩子 ，OK， 虽然他在疫情的过程当中，他是亚洲人，可是他不是中国人，他长得也不是很明显的像亚洲人的样子，可是他同样的在这个整个疫情的这个事件当中呢，他随时随地都感受到这个对亚裔仇恨的这种恐惧感，不管在他上学放学的路上，他出门，他在家，他时时刻刻都感受到这种恐惧。
Our community is in a vulnerable state, and it is extremely important for us to reconnect with one another in solidarity. That even though your experience with hate can be different from mine, we still stand and support one another as one. That being said, there have been good things that we have accomplished during this difficult pandemic. Lynn, Aleena, and I, as well as our other friends, worked together to create a club at our school called APABA-PA, which stands for Asian Pacific Islander Union.
所以他说呢，就是虽然是这段疫情时期，大家经历很多困难，可是这些了不起的孩子，他们大家合作起来，成立了这个组织啊，叫做 APIU， 这个就是亚裔的学生，大家合作起来，要能够来为自己做一些事情。
In our club, we strive to create a safe space for AAPI students while addressing our history, issues, and important events. The process wasn't perfect because it felt like we were digging up and scrambling parts to form a community, but honestly, I'm proud of how far we've come. The biggest event that APIU had was this year, and it was the APIU Showcase. The showcase was an anti-international day that directly attacked the white gaze and was an act of resistance against oppression.
所以他说他们这个组织，这个学生的组织 APIU 呢，他们是要专注在于发表，就是广泛的让别人接触理解这个历史，亚裔的历史跟亚裔的一些个人的一些事件，还有就是一些活动。OK， 他提到了这个他们举办这个 International Day 国际日。能够让别人理解，对他们的文化背景有更深的理解。
The showcase had an opening where AAPI students would celebrate their culture through music, poems, and speeches. Afterwards, we held many workshops that addressed different topics. For example, we had one with solidarity with other POC, which I personally loved because we brought in our fellow Black students and they talked about their history and how we worked together throughout history. And it felt like we were just rewriting history's mistakes. We talked about certain aspects of API history and talked about Southeast Asia's history. We also talked about mental health, migration, and so much more. This is just the beginning for APIU. We will continue to work, improve, and build our community. Thank you.
所以他们这个学生的组织 APIU 做了非常非常棒的一些工作，就是让大家能够融入、能够理解的啊。他们举办这个 International Day 呢，跟大家分享每一种亚洲的每一个地区的不同的文化。跟他们的音乐，跟他们的食物，他们在这个举办完这些表演以后呢，他们也有很多分了小组的讨论， 跟大家分享每一个区域不同的一些性质。谢谢大家。
Thank you so much, Lynn, Aleena, Jaira. That was so amazing. I'm getting messages for folks who would love to have you present and share your best practices with other levels of government. You have really provided some real tangible solutions that could be brought to scale at other schools if the district can adequately fund and support your efforts. So thank you so much for your very powerful presentation.
Anna 对于这3位非常非常棒的学生玲玲、Aleena 跟 Jaira， 非常感谢你们今天来给我们提供这么多，不光是有实质的一些经验，你们也提出了非常非常好的有建设性的意见。我们希望呢以后能够你们继续好好努力。然后 Anna 也收到很多人发了信件过来就是希望要将来有机会能够邀请你们到别的学校，到他们的学校去去发表，去跟他们分享。
And I want to thank Mr. Ken Hung, an amazing educator. I think throughout this presentation, we have really heard from students that we need trusted adults who aren't afraid to advocate and to stand with our students in their times of crisis and to help amplify them. And I think Mr. Hung has really shown us, all of us, adults, families, community leaders, government representatives, what that allyship really means. We need to go beyond allyship and really become accomplices and partners in amplifying what our students demand in terms of equity and justice.
我们也要特别要来感谢这个 Ken Hung 这个洪老师，这样子了不起的一个教育人员。我们可以看到他对他的学生的支持，他对他的学生的祈祷，实在是提出了非常非常大的贡献。我们这些成人跟家长呢，也可以从洪老师身上能够看到说，在这个社会里面，为了我们社区里面我们自己的孩子，这些年轻的学生，我们应该要做一个什么样的角色？我们不是只是要教育他们，我们要支持他们，我们要能够做他们的倡导人，我们要能够帮他们把他们的声音发得更大更亮。所以非常感谢洪老师。
And because we are running past time, I'm going to really shorten my presentation. But, my name is Anna. As Agnes mentioned, I'm from the Chinatown Disability Advocacy Project, and we're a coalition of families, immigrants with disabilities, and other advocates and leaders.
Anna 她今天会把她的这一份演讲呢要缩短一点，因为我们时间很长了。Anna 我们大家都知道 Anna 是一个我们社区里面的一个领袖，她非常大的贡献她是这个华府残障人员宣导会的一个最主要的成员。那她也有另外还有的就是这个疫苗 ，OK， 这个疫苗我们组织了另外一个联盟，这个他们为社区里面做了很多很多有益的贡献。
And also in this group is Agnes and Mandy Lin, a parent advocate. She's not a panelist right now, but she's definitely one of the co-founders, and I wanted to recognize her.
所以我们这个组织里面也有我自己本身，我也是一个成员，还有就是 Mandy Lin， 她今天她不发表，可是她在我想 Mandy 在听，是不是她也给我们提出了非常大的贡献，她自己也是一个母亲，跟大家分享了很多她的宝贵的经验。
So my personal experience, is very similar to what we've heard from the students. I I grew up as a student with severe anxiety that made it difficult for me to communicate outside of my home. It's a condition called selective mutism.
所以 Anna 她跟大家分享的就是她自己本身成长的经验跟这些学生是非常类似的。她在成长的过程当中，她有一个症状，就是非常非常严重的焦虑，就是在她很焦虑的时候，她没有办法跟别人用言语来沟通。这个医学上讲的是选择性的聋哑。
And so when I was called racial slurs in school, like every single day in front of adults, in front of school administrators, in front of the other parents, you know, as a student, I noticed that they were too uncomfortable to even acknowledge what was happening.
所以他在学生的时代啊，他几乎每天都被别人讲这种侮辱性的这个种族歧视的这些言辞。可是他注意到的就是，就算是其他的家长、老师、成人、学生都在旁边，这个对大部分人来说是一个很不舒适的一种状况，所以大家都装傻。
Right. And, you know, in times when I had to physically defend myself, that was the only time that adults would actually intervene.
所以他自己本身的经验就是，只有在他需要实际上用体能上的方式来反击的时候呢，成人才会来干预。
Later on, when I got to high school, my high school put a police station inside of our high school because that's how common, you know, school violence was every day. And yet their approach, which was only to repeatedly suspend people and treat us like we were all criminals, did not resolve community tensions and did not actually give us the support and skills we need to resolve community tensions on our own.
然后等到那个 Anna 她上高中的时候，她说实际上她的高中有一个全职在那边上班的一个警察 ，OK， 等于是有一个警察局在学校里。这个就是在那个当时呢，高中的环境 OK 是不安全到那样的地步。可是就连这样的措施，他们的目标也只是在控制行为，实际上并没有去帮助学生来化解任何的问题。
Eventually, there was a peer leadership program that took those students who were repeatedly suspended and really taught them the skills to become conflict resolution mediators. And this was a really great way to bring students together and to empower us to solve our problems without police. Unfortunately, that program was undermined by our high school principal, who really preferred to be more punitive and even referred to us as thugs.
所以他是说，后来经过了一段时间呢，他们学校就是成立了一个这个，就是学生彼此互相帮助这个领导的一个机会，就是有很多学生呢，因为经历过这些冲突，然后被学校惩罚了以后，大家聚集起来，然后讨论我们怎么样用好的方式，用讨论的方式来用化解的方式解决这些问题。这个是一个很好的一个组织，当时是非常好的一个方向。可是很可惜的就是 Anna 她学校那个时候的校长觉得这个并不是那么重要的一样事情，所以这个后来也就并没有继续做下去。
So I was originally going to cover some statistics about statewide bullying, and you know what our local school district of Philadelphia reports as bullying and incidents of racial and ethnic intimidation. The first survey is a voluntary statewide survey of youth. And the second one, is required, but, as you can see on the PowerPoint, there are very large differences in numbers. But because we are short on time, I'm going to move ahead to some of the experiences that the families in our group, and although we primarily support immigrants with disabilities, there have been Black families, white families, Latinx families that have come to me for help in reporting incidents of bullying or harassment. So I'm about to share some of the common barriers that we've had.
所以 Anna 本来准备了很多数据啊，就是要能够让大家看到这个学龄的孩童他们所被欺凌的这些数字 ，OK。可是因为时间很有限，所以他要跟大家分享的就是我们这个组织华附残障这个宣导会，我们这些家庭的在疫情以前的实际经验。所以虽然我们是一个社区的一个组织呢，可是 Anna 她有很多经验，就是有不管是黑人、白人、拉丁种族的人，就是有这些残障的人士也有来寻求 Anna 的帮助。
So as Lynn, Aleena, and Jaira have mentioned, there are barriers for students, and they did such a great job covering, the internal barriers for students in terms of expressing what's happening and asking adults for assistance. I just wanted to cover other issues, such as, families reporting that the bullying was tolerated or even encouraged, depending on the social status of the bullies within the school community.
所以 Anna 她说，刚才 Lynn 跟 Aleena 跟 Jaira 把他们学生那一方面的角度跟大家表达的非常非常好。所以现在 Anna 她要跟大家分享的就是说，我们这个组织里面呢，我们听过很多很多家长跟我们分享，他们的孩子被别人欺凌了的时候，在他们跟学校报告的时候 ，OK， 有很多时候是非常明显的，学校支持的就是那一些也许经济条件比较好的家庭，或者是别种主流种族的家庭。
So in instances where the students do want to talk to someone about their feelings or their struggles, the students have shared that sometimes families are unwilling to help them access mental health treatment outside of the school. When the students want to seek counseling within the school, there are high student to staff ratios, and sometimes the lack of vocational diversity in terms of who is providing the counseling and student supports makes it so that the students don't necessarily feel that they can go to the school counselor for help.
还有就是在有很多学生，他们感觉到他们需要辅导，他们需要支持的时候呢，有很多家庭并不愿意来处理这样的事情，很多家长对这个精神辅导有很大的排斥感 ，OK？ 那在这些学生想要到学校能够找辅导员，能够帮助他们的时候，很多时候他们也找不到适当的真正能够理解他们的工作人员。
And students have shared that they have been discouraged by adults that they trusted from even filing complaints. And in times when they have tried to file complaints, whether it's a school professional, there are issues with properly documenting the issues, investigating, and then communicating back to the student and family what the outcomes were.
所以学生他们也有分享的，就是他们真正是感觉到有必要来正式的提出这个对别人欺凌他们的这个控诉的时候呢，很多时候不管是他们的同学或者是他们的父母亲， 还是学校的这些职业的老师，都会劝他们不要来经过这个正式的这个方式来提出这些案件。
And I can also share that there's confusion among the adults. What is bullying or harassment? I mentioned before that sometimes it's encouraged behavior or it's normalized as a part of adolescence. In some cases, the school professionals that are responsible for reporting may also be afraid of retaliation. There are also language barriers, such as lack of training on how to help immigrant families and students, make complaints. And staff have shared that the professional development that is provided is not necessarily meaningful or effective in addressing these. And then lastly, because of staffing issues, there's just not enough staff available to properly supervise and intervene or provide the counseling and other supports. In some cases, the school psychologists are assigned to 16 schools, or a counselor might have over 150 students. So these are things that structurally make it very difficult for us to adequately support the students who have different needs and need to feel safe. So I think these are areas where the systems and school professionals also need to get it together.
所以在这个很多这些成人来处理这些事情的时候啊，有很多成人工作人员、老师或者是家长，也对这件事情的本质非常困惑，也不知道什么是叫做欺凌，或者什么是这个威胁。OK， 那所以很多时候就是在学校，在学生要来在学校寻求帮助的时候呢，他们学校也是大部分的学校也没有足够的资源，然后这些专业的人呢，也许对文化背景或者对这个移民的这些背景并没有非常完整的理解，也不能够提出很好的服务，然后很多时候他们也没有足够的专人来处理这些案件。我们经常听到的就是，比如说一个社工要管16个学校的学生，或者一个辅导员他手下需要管150个学生，这是不可能达到的。
Our student leaders did an amazing job talking about how the cultural, generational, and language differences, even within the families, can make it difficult, right, for students to go to their parents and express what's happening. I know parents have shared that they're really confused about all the different social media platforms, and they don't know what apps their students are using, whether they're engaging in safe online behaviors, to even begin to understand what their student is trying to tell them. So there's also like a digital divide between the parents and the students that I think schools can help support and bridge. But the other piece is, aside from the different working hours, and as Mr. Hung alluded to, that schools need to do a better job of weaving supports and meeting these families who work in hospitality, who work as essential workers that aren't available during traditional school hours to go to school meetings or advocate, that we've got to find other ways to bridge the community. And that's by, I think, partnering with community organizations, local nonprofits, and trusted leaders. But the one thing I wanted to mention is that a lot of the families that have attempted to call the bullying hotline or send an email, most of them tell me that they have not even gotten an acknowledgement that their complaint was received. So when we tell people just call the hotline, and an entire community can tell you, oh, don't call the hotline, nothing's going to happen. We can't really just blame the victims to say, well, you didn't report enough. There has to be follow through and documentation of what happens. So I really think that this is, when multiple people across race, language are saying don't even bother calling the family and community engagement office. They won't advocate for you. Then I think we need to really look honestly at that and figure out where the breakdown is. And I personally think that the district does not necessarily document because they don't want to necessarily have to investigate. So I think we really just have to be honest here. When you look at the numbers that the school district reports of, there's over 1,000 incidents of bullying and harassment, but very few are ever characterized as ethnic intimidation. There is a disconnect between what these students are sharing as daily experiences of racism that are happening for years and what the district actually turns over or reports to our government. So sorry, Agnes, I know that was a lot, but I'm trying to wrap up my remarks.
Okay, so Anna, 她提出来，我们刚才那3位那么了不起的学生啊，他们把他们自己的经验跟大家分享了，所以大家都知道，在这个他们跟他们自己的家长之间也有一些隔绝 ，OK， 他们不愿意让父母担心，所以很多事情没有拿出来分享。那还有一个问题就是 Anna 提出来的，就是因为现在有很多这些社交的网络的社交平台 ，OK， 大部分的家长呢对这些平台完全不清楚 ，OK， 所以他们也不知道就是有什么事件发生在网络上，别人怎么样欺负他们的孩子，他们也弄不清楚到底是怎么一回事情，所以这些都是对这些新移民家庭的父母是非常非常困难、非常极端的困惑的一件事情。所以 Anna 提出来的就是，这个就是学校在这个时候，就像刚才洪老师也提出的，就是这是学校可以在这个状况下来做一个桥梁，来帮助这些学生跟家长之间有更好的一个理解，因为毕竟这些家长并不理解这个美国这个主流的社会 ，OK， 所以还有呢，就是学校有义务要来理解这些我们的新移民的家长，工作时间是非常不寻常的长，对不对？很多时候学校的活动他们没有办法参与，学校的会议他们不能来，然后加上了语言的问题，所以学校有义务一定要来尽量用任何的方式能够来跟家长有直接的沟通，这是他们应该要做到的。还有就是他说那个有很多家长有分享说，有一个电话号码，你如果孩子被别人欺负、被别人欺凌、有种族的什么歧视的话，你可以打这个号码去报告。可是基本上呢，这个号码你打了以后留了话，从很多例子都是根本没有人回你的话，你根本不知道他们有没有听到这个。然后他说学区有发表说，在1000个这个欺凌的这些案件里面，实际上有很少的比例是因为这个种族的威胁的 ，OK， 所以这是学区并没有做到的，他们该做的一件事情，也希望大家能够理解。
Thank you. So in 2016, we filed a federal complaint. Our experience was trying to get the system to provide language access or even tell us who to file complaints with was really difficult. And, thanks to the Department of Education Office of Civil Rights, there were changes made at the state and local level. And Robin is going to present more about the different policies. And, because we are limited on time, I think what I'll do is I'll send this information. This came from the School District of Philadelphia about the steps that they recommend that families take and the types of issues that, you can report. But as I mentioned before, this doesn't necessarily match the experience of community members and students. So we have more work to do. Looking at the COVID-19 pandemic, as the 3 student leaders have discussed, there was COVID-19 related harassment. and families felt unsafe trying to access free food, school supplies, Chromebooks that were being distributed. And Philly for Solidarity, Humphrey Ha, is on this listening, but he created a video recording of student youth talking about the impact of anti-Asian hate. And, you know, in those testimonials, a young person had shared that because AAPI youth don't feel safe returning to in-person school, some of them are now purchasing weapons to keep themselves safe.
所以这个 Anna 她分享的就是2016年的时候，他们有提出一个正式的一个报告，就是希望学区能够提供这个语言的 OK 语言的这个翻译啊。这个呢，在这是一个联邦政府的一个条例，他们正式的提出来的。然后2017年的时候，这个学区开始提供了，所以这是很感激的一件事情。这个我们等一下请 Marvin 要再跟我们深入解释。还有他刚才有给大家看了一个程序，就是如果你有这种就是被欺凌、被歧视的这种经验的话，你可以遵照这个程序跟学区提出诉讼 ，OK？ 可是呢，我们刚才也有讲到，就是那个电话号码经常是没有人回话的，所以我们这一方面我们还有很多工作需要做的。OK， 还有刚才我们有提到的，就是有很多家庭在疫情的时期 ，OK， 家长觉得很害怕去拿免费的食物跟学校的必用品，还有像那个电脑，学校的电脑，因为他们觉得怕不安全，不愿意去。因为这个疫情的对这个亚裔的对中国人的歧视的问题，引起这些状况。然后呢，现在我们要讨论的就是现在大家要回去复学的这个过程当中，很多学生，我们听到有很多报告，就是这些学生呢，因为感觉到他们的安全有受到威胁，他们有很多学生现在在买武器，要能够让他们自卫的，这个也是一个非常极端的一个现象。
So I just want to talk about, you know, what does this upcoming school year look like? As was reported in the news, the school district of Philadelphia changed its bell schedules. So high school students, most of them will have to arrive around 7:30 in the morning. And the school district, as Mr. Hung pointed out, you know, subsidizes public transit passes, but doesn't necessarily see themselves as responsible for student safety. You know, Chinatown Disability Advocacy Project has asked the Philadelphia Police Department if they could assign more crossing guards near those transit stops, but they are experiencing staffing shortages. We've also asked, along with other members of city government, like Office of Immigrant Affairs, if SEPTA could put up more anti-Asian harassment public service announcements so bystanders know what to do to help, you know, our AAPI students. We've also asked the police department for their Walk Safe PHL and Town Watch programs to undergo bystander and bias training. And we've also asked the school district if they could establish a safe corridor program where students and other school community members can volunteer and help escort their peers to and from the school activities.
所以我们Anna 她有讲说，这个学区发表了他们这个上学的时间有变化啊，就是高中学生呢要7点半到达学校，然后他们也可是还有一件事情就是学区虽然给学生提供这个交通工具的这个车票，可是他们并不对他们学生上学放学的路程的安全来负责任。OK， 所以有很多高中的学生呢，因为要那么早去上学，所以很多他们 也许早上5点就要离开家，才能够准时的到学校。所以这个对大家来讲是一个非常大的一个安全的问题。然后我们这个华埠残障人士这个宣导会呢，有跟费城的警察局提出要求，请他们能够提供更多的这个就是值办交通的这个安全人员，在学校附近来帮助学生。可是他们基本上就是说，他们找不到足够的人来做这些工作。还有就是华埠这个残障宣导会呢，也跟 SEPTA 提出要求，请他们在车跟那个地铁上能够有录音的一个发表的，就是要让大家提醒要怎么样对这个亚裔的这个欺凌的事件怎么样的反应的方式。还有这个宣导会也有提出，就是请大家组织这个，还有就是组织一些辅导会啊，就是提醒大家、教导大家怎么样在你看到这些事情发生的时候怎么样反应。还有就是是不是跟学生一起步行，要大家能够来帮助他们能够安全的到学校。还有就是我们也跟学区要求了啊，就是让他们在学校里面有走廊呢，有安全的走廊，能够让有那个学生有做义工来帮助大家换教室。
Thank you. So, we've made those requests since like March and in email April. I just think a part of the challenge is very little response or follow up or follow through. And I know Mr. Hung and the students have talked about how as a community, we just can't be reactive to individual incidents, and that's when we show up and, we're upset. There has to be actual follow through and work to actually put these programs, fund them, and support the implementation.
所以 Anna 她从3月4月就开始跟学区、跟这个社区里面的相关的人提出了这么多的要求 ，OK？ 可是呢，同样的是很难得到答复 ，OK？ 很难，这个是非常困难的一个工作的过程 ，OK？ 他非常非常努力的帮大家争取。可是就像刚才洪老师所提出的，我们不能够用一个被动的方式来等别人帮我们做事情，我们要把声音提出来，我们要把这些要求提出来，我们要能够来改变这个法律上对我们权利的保护。
Thank you. And these suggestions didn't just come from me, it's from the parents in our support group who have asked their children, their students, what would help you? So I want to make sure that I make clear that these aren't my great ideas, but that as we have over the past 6 years, we ask the directly impacted families and students in our support group what their recommendations are.
所以 Anna 她要跟大家强调的就是，她所提出的这些方案、这些要求呢，都是她自己本身的主意。OK， 我们在过去6年当中，我们不断的跟我们这个成员、这些家庭、这些家长沟通，我们问他们的意见，我们探讨他们的需要，然后这些家庭呢，也跟他们自己家庭的成员、跟他们社区的成员彼此沟通，甚至于跟他们的孩子沟通，让大家知道说我们实际上真的能够有效的需要的有哪些。然后 Anna 花了很大的功夫把这些整理出来，然后经过很困难的途径去帮大家提出这些要求的。
So the last thing I want to mention is that right now the school district last Friday announced that they will have, in-person learning and a virtual academy for students who choose to remain in virtual learning. But what is not really very widely discussed is that students who choose to attend the virtual academy will lose their placements. They will not have the same teachers. They will not have the same bilingual counselor who has been supporting them. And according to publicly available data on the virtual academy, the teacher to student ratio is 1 teacher to 105 students. So, they have additionally stated that their only offer of a free and appropriate public education for students with disabilities is for in-person learning. So families in our support group have been very concerned about losing all of those supports if they have young children who are too young to get vaccinated or due to their disabilities cannot safely wear a mask and go to in-person school. And statistically, research shows that people with intellectual disabilities are more likely than non-disabled people to contract COVID-19, get admitted to the hospital, and die. And yet, these are the options that are facing our immigrants with disabilities and their families, which just feel like, incredibly unfair. The deadline for families to respond is August 13th. And these families don't even have time to meet with their school teams or even have a conversation to figure out what's going to be most appropriate for them. So I know that there are folks from the school district listening. I really encourage the school district to host a Zoom to have communication with families in a language that they can understand about how to really individualize the learning program for these students and protect their civil rights instead of trying to force everyone to go in person if that's not what's most appropriate for them.
所以这个学区在过去的上个星期五发表了，就是如果因为我们现在要复学，9月要复学，如果学生不能够亲自面对面去回到学校去上学的话，他们的另外一个选择是这个网络的学院 ，OK？ 那可是问题在于，这些孩子呢，如果在网络学院的话，他们的平常以前在过去得到的服务很多会失去，他们基本上就是会失去这个双语的这些辅导，还有很多其他的相关的服务，他们这个基本上，这个以数据来说的话，这个网络学院是只有1个老师要教105个学生 ，OK？ 所以如果学生选择这个方式的话呢，他们是不能够得到，他们本来的老师或者是本来的环境，那所以。还有就是很多学生，就是我们的团体里面的学生，有一些残障的，有一些健康上的问题的孩子呢，他们有很多现在年纪还太小，还不能打疫苗，或者是他们有一些健康上的一些问题，让他们不能够戴口罩，所以这些孩子是因为健康安全的问题。不能够回到学校的环境，可是，在统计上来说呢，这些孩子就是有残疾的孩子，是比普通的正常的孩子得到疫苗、得到疫情，然后要上医院，或者甚至是死亡的机会，是比普通的孩子要大得多的。OK， 是要大差不多2.5倍的。那现在呢，因为学区要求这些家长要能够选择回到学校去上学，还是在网络上这个网络学院，这个他们要求的是在8月13号之前能够做一个决定。可是很多家长真的是不知道应该要怎么样决定。因为他们感觉到，就是如果他们的孩子 为了怕失去一个好的教育的机会，回到学校的话，会让他们安全跟健康都会引起很大的威胁。
Thank you. And the last thing I want to say is it doesn't have to be this way. You know, under the American Rescue Plan from the Biden-Harris administration and that Congress signed into law, Pennsylvania received $5.1 billion. The school district of Philadelphia reportedly received $1.3 billion. So I would just encourage people who are concerned, whether you're a student, a parent, a community leader, to show up at the monthly Board of Education meetings to testify and share your thoughts and amplify what these students are asking for. Or you can also submit written testimony if you're not able to participate in those meetings. And we'll send out the links for people to know how to register and see the calendar. So again, I really want to thank everyone for listening and bearing with us. You know, kudos to those of you who have stayed on because it is so important and we need everyone involved, even if you don't personally have a student, you know, who is in the school district or going through these things. We've heard the impact of anti-Asian hate on these students, on our educators, on our families, and we really need all of you to amplify and support the things that we really need to truly have safe school communities. Thank you.
Anna 她提出一些数据，就是这个 Biden 总统跟副总统 Harris 他们所提出的这个美国急救这个计划的基金啊，宾州收到了51亿，然后费城的学校收到了13亿，这是非常大的数字。可是我们需要发言，我们这个社区需要发言，我们需要能够提出我们的要求，让他们知道，把这么大的一笔基金呢，要用最好的方式能够运用，才能够对我们的学生有实际上的利益。所以 Anna 她邀请大家在那个学区他们开董事会的时候，这是大家都可以去参加。她邀请大家尽量能够加入，然后发言，把你的意见，把你的声音提起来 ，OK， 让别人知道你所需的是什么。如果你不能亲自去参加的话，他也请你可以用书写的方式把这些问题提出来送过去 ，OK， 我们需要发言，谢谢大家。
Thank you. And now we have Robin Lipp from Berney and Sang to talk about the actual policies and laws that exist to protect our students and families. Robin?
Thank you, Anna. Thank you, Ken.
Robin 开始，他是这位律师啊，从 Berney and Sang 他来的这位律师 Robin Lipp 帮我们发表。
Thank you, Anna. Thank you, Ken. Thank you, Zhang. And of course, thank you, Lynn, Aleena, and Jaira. I'm just going to take one moment to share my screen or see if there's a way to share the slides. Looks like
Robin 他说非常感谢今天这么多这么优秀的讲员，这3位学生，洪老师 Anna， 现在他把他的资料找出来跟大家分享。
I could try to share, Robin.
Thank you. All right, and also, of course, thank you to Jennifer Sang. So I'm substituting for Jennifer today because she's sick. These are her slides. I don't want to take credit for her work, but I'm going to talk a little bit about the laws that protect students in Pennsylvania, and particularly focusing on the laws that apply to bullying against Asian students. And so I have good news and I have bad news. And the bad news is that there is no enforceable anti-bullying statute in Pennsylvania. So that's the bad news. The good news is that there are laws at the federal level and at the state level and also at the city level in Philadelphia that potentially apply in this context because they prohibit discrimination on the basis of race and they prohibit discrimination on the basis of national origin. And the way that those statutes typically apply in the bullying context is that a racially hostile environment is prohibited.
所以 Robin 他先要跟大家提出来的就是今天的这些材料是 Jennifer Sang 他帮我们准备的啊，他要谢谢 Jennifer。那 Jennifer 今天生病不能来，他是来取代他，所以他第一件事情他要跟大家解释的就是，在这个法律的立场，我们要怎么样保护学生？就是在宾州呢，并没有能够实际上实行的这个欺凌，停止欺凌的这个法令 ，OK？ 如果说这些欺凌的案件，或者是侮辱的案件，是因为种族的原因的话，家庭呢可以提出在法律上，在这3条法律 ，OK？ 能够以这3条法律做基础，能够提出控诉。
And one other consideration that's not listed here, but is also important to consider, is the First Amendment. And the First Amendment also places constraints on the types of speech that schools can regulate, because schools are government actors, and so schools are bound by the First Amendment. Public schools are, and if certain forms of verbal harassment, if they're not severe enough, schools may be constrained in what they could actually do to ban those forms of harassment.
所以他现在要跟大家解释的就是这个美国的第1条这个法令就是说学校并不能控制，因为大家有发言权，所以他们在法律上来说并不能够控制这个语言上的一些用法，一些语言。
So now that's okay. Now I focus mostly on the bad news. Now I'm going to get into some of the good news. So here are the statutes and laws that provide you with some degree of protection. So we have the Pennsylvania Human Relations Act, the Philadelphia Fair Practices Ordinance, and then Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And all of these are anti-discrimination laws. And I'm going to go through them in sequence and talk a little bit about how they can protect you. I just want to go to the next slide. So the Pennsylvania Human Relations Act bans discrimination in a variety of different contexts, and it applies to public accommodations, which include schools, and it's enforced by this administrative agency, which is the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission. So this is why I'm going to talk about this more in detail in a few minutes, but this is part of the reason why it's so important to document everything that's happening, is because what these bodies are going to consider when they start their investigations is going to be the evidence that you've compiled over time. And your rights can also be affected by what you communicate and when you communicate it. So even if you feel like you're sort of butting up against a brick wall where everything you send to the school is not being responded to, there's no follow through, it's not being implemented, it's still important to communicate and to document that, because that's part of what these investigative bodies are going to consider when they do their investigations.
所以 Robin 跟大家分享的这个是宾州的这个人文关系的一个法令就是说你在提出这些诉讼的时候，这个是有时间性的 ，OK， 基本上就是你一定要在事件发生的180天之内报告这件事件，所以很多时候，就算家长或者学生感觉到他们跟学校所诉讼的这些事情发生，学校并没有帮他们解决问题，可是呢，还是非常重要，因为如果你当时你有做报告的话，这个在法律上你就有权利来提出这个案件。
And last, I want to talk about this point in the middle here about 180 days. So the Pennsylvania Supreme Court recently decided, due to a case actually that was brought by my firm, that minority tolling applies to the Pennsylvania Human Relations Act. And what that means is that after this time period, this 180-day period, doesn't begin to kick in until the age of majority. So you have some extra time. Especially if you're 17 or 16 now, you think about, maybe bringing a suit within 180 days of your 18th birthday. It gives you a little bit of extra leeway.
所以他提出来，他刚才有说的这个180天的这个限期啊，这个有很多考虑的因素。他要提醒大家的就是，在最近，这个宾州的最高法院实际上实施这个法令啊，就是如果这个学生，比如说你是高中的学生，你现在16岁，或者是17岁 ，OK， 你要注意的就是你在提出这个控诉的时候，你有多长的时间，是不是在180天之内，你就会满18岁，到了成人的年纪。
All right, if we could go to the next slide, and then I'm just, oh yeah. And so the Philadelphia Fair Practices Ordinance, I'll breeze through these because they have a really similar structure. So it's the same kind of arrangement, except this is happening at the city level instead of the state level. And you have a slightly different time frame to file your complaints. It has to happen within 300 days of the incident. There's a form that's linked over there where you can report violations. There's a hotline that has been much discussed, and there is an email address as well. But it's a very similar process where if you file a complaint, what'll happen is an investigation, and then that investigation can culminate in a finding of cause, that yes, there has been discrimination, or no, there's a finding of no cause, and then depending on what happens, you can file suit then in court. You have, after 1 year, if nothing happens, you automatically have a right to file in court. But you also can do that after there's a finding of cause or no cause. So I think the important thing to emphasize here, though, is that discrimination is happening intensely in real time, and these processes take a long period of time. So I'm also going to talk a little bit about what can be done in the short term, because I wouldn't place confidence in these agencies being able to mobilize very quickly to address the concerns that are affecting people now.
所以这个是刚才 Robin 跟大家看到有3个法令，这个是第2个法令，这是费城的公平的一个条例啊，公平的这个一个条例。他所说的是呢，你在事件发生的以后，一定要在300天之内，跟这个费城的这个人文关系的这个组织提出一个控诉 ，OK？ 可是这个时间非常重要，是一定要在300天之内。所以如果在刚才他说的是，就是如果他们没有采取行动的话，在1年之后，1年之内，1年之后，你这个控诉人呢就有权利把这个案件呈上法庭 ，OK？ 所以这也是给你的一个权利，就是如果他们没有处理、没有反应的话，你可以正式的，就是上庭去解决这个事情。然后他还有就是他要提出来的就是很多这些法律的途径都是要经过很长很长的时间 ，OK？ 所以这是没有办法程序上的问题。可是，在短期之内呢，我们要提醒自己的就是，我们需要采取行动，然后你要理解法律上给你哪些权利。
All right, if we could go to the next slide. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the federal component, and there's a relationship between the federal component and the state and the local component. Very often courts will look to what's happening at the federal level to interpret the state and the local laws. And so it's all kind of interconnected. And the U.S. Education Department's Office for Civil Rights is the agency that enforces this particular federal law, and they conduct investigations, and they can do things, for example, like train staff. They could implement, and all of the agencies can do this, by the way, but historically in Philadelphia, the federal agencies have had a greater impact. And so about a decade ago, there was a case, there was pervasive violence and discrimination happening against Asian students at South Philadelphia High School. The Department of Justice brought a case against the Philadelphia School District that culminated in a settlement agreement. And as a result, there were changes that were put in place to actually try to improve bullying and harassment policies, specifically the policies that were affecting Asian students in Philadelphia a decade ago. I think we talked a little bit about this, but unfortunately, since then, there's been an erosion of those policies. And the most unfortunate part from my perspective is that in 2020, shortly after the pandemic began, the policies were actually revised in a way that completely stripped out preventative measures and focuses entirely on responsive measures. And so if you think about what's actually most impactful for students in terms of bullying and harassment, prevention, you might imagine, would be something that would be more helpful than just dealing with cases after the fact.
所以现在 Robin 他提出来的就是1946年的一个美国的市民就是人权的一个法令啊。这个上面讲的就是说，这个教育部他们有权利运用这个法令来保护所有的学生 ，OK， 然后建立一些这个学校的措施，好比说雇一些重要的人员来做这些职务，或者是处理这些案件 ，OK。那还有这个就都是种族歧视相关的，或者是跟种族歧视不相关的一些事情。那他提到的就是刚才冯老师也有跟我们提到，2009年的时候，那个南费城的高中他们提出了一个投诉，那个投诉的过程呢，让我们现在得到了很多的权利 ，OK， 所以他是说这个是大家需要理解的，然后在2020年的时候就是去年的时候，他们有费城的这个，他们有一些改变计划，就是他们不再做预防的这个方式，他们只做急救的方式。那可是 Robin 他所提出来的就是，像我们刚才3位学生跟我们表达的，如果我们能够有一些预防歧视的一些措施的话，也许是更好的方式。
So, and again, just to emphasize here, I talked about minority tolling in the context of the Pennsylvania Human Relations Act, but that doesn't apply, at least currently, under these other statutes. And so there's a very tight time frame in terms of if you were going to pursue a complaint under Title VI, there's this very tight 180-day time frame, which of course with the burdens that everyone's facing during the pandemic, with language barriers, with schoolwork barriers, with mental health barriers, you know, with repeated trauma and the trauma of having to document and pursue these cases, obviously being part of that, it's just something to really keep in mind that a lot of these areas of law have very strict deadlines. And so it's always a good idea to consult with an attorney or consult with an advocate as soon as possible to make sure that you're just aware of what these deadlines are.
Robin 他要提醒大家的就是这3条法律，它是保护了大家很多的权利。可是呢，这个法律上的这些法律上的规矩，就是都有时间性的。所以现在大家面临的这个疫情的很多后遗症，不管是生活方面的、工作方面、学校、家庭、人际关系，所以大家都承担了很大的压力。那在这种时候呢，这个又是一个新的一个责任可是非常重要的就是，请大家不要忘记，这个3个条例有不同的时间性，可是基本上其中3个里面的2个都是一定要在180天之内，在事件发生的180天之内提出报告 ，OK， 这是非常要紧的一件事情。如果我们需要改变法律、改变我们得到的待遇的话，我们是一定要采取正确的途径。那这些也是让大家法律上这些事情让大家很困惑。 所以在有必要的时候呢，请你去找一位对这些事情这些方面有理解的律师，请律师来帮助你 ，OK， 所以他要提醒大家要注意这个时间的限制。
All right, so now I'm going to go to the next slide, and I think we're going to talk about, yeah, so here are just, I mean, first of all, we talked about this a little bit. I mean, one major barrier, and this especially applies for younger children, is that, you know, often parents aren't even aware of what's going on in the schools. And for obviously for high school students, you know, you are, and even middle school students, you're probably capable of documenting what's happening to yourself and starting to take action on your own behalf. But for younger students in particular, who are also victims of bullying and harassment, it's really hard to be self-advocates, and your parents may not be able to figure out what's going on. And so this is advice here for families. What do you do with a younger student who, you know, is potentially showing signs that something's happening in school, and how do you know when to sort of be more proactive? And so obviously looking for things like increased isolation, decreased appetite, nightmares, decreased interest in sort of things that the student previously found enjoyable, decreased interest in going to school would obviously be a glaring sign. These are just practical advice for parents in terms of trying to say, when should I be asking more questions about what's happening in school?
所以现在啊，我们讨论的是，就是因为我们要知道在什么样的状况下适当的提出这些报告 ，OK？ 所以刚才Robin 他鼓励大家的就是大一点的孩子呢，高中学生甚至于是初中的学生，他们可以自己碰到一些事件，自己记录下来 ，OK？ 负责任记录下来，然后找一个适当的途径。可是如果是年纪比较小的孩子，小学的或者是更小的孩子呢，家长需要能够知道怎么样观察，知道你的孩子他承受了一些压力，因为这个歧视的案件引起的。所以他现在跟大家分享的就是几个方面啊，就是怎么样观察你的孩子。如果家长你注意到你的孩子他情绪上有改变 ，OK？ 他失去食欲，或者是晚上睡眠不好，会做噩梦，或者是他感觉到孤立，然后他以前喜欢玩的东西他现在不感兴趣，或者他就是不愿意去上学的话，这些都代表这个孩子他行为上表现了他的内部的产生的一些恐惧感或者忧虑。
And the other things on this list are important too, and I'm going to particularly emphasize the last one, but on the next slide, but I'm going to go into the middle two here. So each school district will have their own bullying and harassment policies. They should be translated and provided in multiple languages. Make sure that you're familiar with those, because those will often be the sort of first line of defense in terms of knowing what the school should be doing and what you should be doing. And even if the school isn't following through on what they should be doing, it's still important to follow those policies in the first instance, because if it ever becomes a legal issue, one of the first things they're going to ask is whether you follow those policies and access those policies. And it also provides you an opportunity to both document what's happening and to make sure the school district is at least officially aware of what's happening.
还有家长需要能够做到的啊，就是你如果有这样的事情，你知道这样的事情有发生的话，你一定要先对这个学区的这些欺凌跟这个孩子受歧视的这些法令、这些程序，你一定要有一个理解。你可以在学校的网站找到这些资料，或者是呢，从学校它会有很多文件。你可以去探讨，还有就是学区会发给每一个家长有一本这个参考书，这个上面都会解释你的孩子的权利。然后还有就是另外一方面，你可以跟别的家庭、跟学校的其他的家长 或者是社区里面的其他的家庭能够彼此互通 ，OK， 彼此分享，就像我们这个组织这样的做法，然后能够彼此学习，知道怎么样处理这些事情。然后一个最重要的一件事情就是，大家发生了任何事件的话，要做记录 ，OK， 日期、地点，然后事情仔细的描述怎么样发生的，这都是非常重要的程序。
And part of what to do also involves, reaching out to other families in the school and the community, trying to understand what other people's experiences are. Obviously, organizing, like we've been talking about all evening, is incredibly important for so many reasons. I mean, one, these agencies are much more likely to take action if there's a widespread problem that's well documented. And also, it's an emotional support group, it's a resource support group, it's a way to provide organized information to decision makers at all sorts of levels, and exert political pressure as well through organizing. I mean, that ultimately was successful a decade ago in creating change, and I think it's just sort of incumbent on everyone to make sure the pressure is maintained in order to make sure that these policies continue to be implemented and improved.
所以为什么我们跟其他的家庭跟社区里面的其他的家庭有联系有分享，这是为什么重要呢？是因为我们大家都知道啊，如果有一个很普遍的一个问题发生的时候，大部分的时候，你这个不管你是跟学区投诉，还是跟采取法律的途径呢，都是。如果大家只听到一个案件的话，也许不会太在意。可是如果他们听到一个社区里面大家有共同的经验的话，那他们就不能够不面对这个问题。OK， 所以这是大家要分享的一个最主要的一个原因。
All right, so now on the next slide, I'm going to talk about documentation, everyone's favorite subject, but it's actually very important. So a few things that you can do as part of your own documentation. So sending letters to school officials is a very effective way of keeping records and communicating at the same time. And so here are the types of things you should make sure that you're keeping records of. So obviously names, dates, places, descriptions of what happened, memory fades. So it's important to do this as soon, after the event as possible. And then also because sometimes your legal rights may depend on when an incident was first reported. If your letter is not the first report, you want to make sure that in the letter you mention when it was first reported, if it was an oral report, and who reported to whom, when did that happen. And also request action because, the school's obligations to act, you want to make sure that those are set in motion so that they don't just sit on this request and don't do anything or don't begin an investigation if there's not that kind of clear sort of request.
所以现在 Robin 告诉大家说，我们要做记录 ，OK， 我们大家都知道，做记录，事情发生，做记录，这是最重要的一样事情。所以你要怎么做记录呢？就是你写一封信，发给学校学校的主管，比如说校长，然后你上面一定要包括的就是事件发生的当时有哪些人，所有的在事件发生的时候相关的人的名字，你的孩子的名字，对方的孩子的名字，四周围朋友所观察到的这些名字，你都要记录下来。然后当天的日期跟当天的时间，还有这个事件是在哪一个地点发生，还有你要能够越详细越好的解释事情发生的过程 ，OK。然后还有就是，如果这件事情以前发生的或者以前发生过的话，你要能够提出你上一次去报告的时候是什么时候。就是这件事情有没有口头上跟别人报告过，然后如果你有报告的话呢， 你是跟谁报告的，也要能够把这个人的名字提出来。然后很重要的就是，你写了这封信以后呢，你也要能够提出要求，请学校给你做具体的解决的方式。OK， 比如说大家请家长来开会，或者是怎么样处理这个案件。
And so related to that, make sure that if there are follow-up efforts, and we've talked about action not happening and the frustration of that. And so the best thing to do is to continue to follow up and to continue documenting those efforts. So if that's an email, save the email somewhere. If it's a phone call, you could write a note that you made a phone call and save that somewhere. And then also another thing that you can do is request records if you're trying to gain an understanding of what's happening more broadly in a school, how they're responding to your report, how they're responding to the reports of other students and their policies. So these are all fun things that lawyers like to do. So that's why I'm focusing on them. But these are all incredibly important for protecting your rights.
所以除了写信给这个学校的主管以外还有2件事情非常重要的。你在提出这个控诉跟提出这个要求以后，你要能够要做记录，就是每一次如果他们没有采取行动的时候，你每一次去问，第一次去问是什么时候，然后第2次是几月几号，这些你都要能够做记录下来。然后还有就是，如果你提出要求的话 ，OK， 有任何相关的文件，你自己都要收理好 ，OK， 然后把这些全部都组织起来，用一个有系统的方式组织起来，然后把这些全部都做记录下来。
All right, next slide. All right, and so that gets us to the end. So I will pass the baton back to Jung, and thank you, Agnes, for the translation.
My pleasure.
Thank you so much. I know this has been a marathon. I just wanted to check in real quick, Anna and Agnes, do we still need interpretation? Because I know you've been going for close to 3 hours, Agnes.
Oh.
Yes, there are attendees who do need the interpretation. So maybe we can just see if there are any questions, or maybe if people want to end the Zoom and email us questions, that's understandable.
I'm good.
You're good? Okay. All right. So there is one outstanding question that I think we should take the time to answer, and it's directed towards Robin. It's from Romana Lee Akiyama. And she asked, can you explain what were the factors that contributed to the erosion of the anti-bullying policies over time?
That is an excellent question. And the short answer is I don't know. The longer answer would be somewhat speculative. And my speculation is that it just takes vigilance and organizing to make sure that policies continue to be implemented and improved. And so, if every time you take the eye off the ball, that's an opportunity for some level of backsliding. And I know it's not fair that policies work that way, and it places an unfair burden on the communities, exactly the communities that are the victims of harassment and discrimination. But unfortunately, I think that's the way it works.
所以这个刚才John 他提出一个问题啊，有一位人士提出一个问题，就是说我们是像这样的这些法律是怎么样能够继续维持，能够来强化的？那 Robin 他的答案就是这个就是只有唯一的方式就是要继续努力啊，就是我们不能够放松，我们要持续的强调这件事情的重要性。
Okay, I think that was the only outstanding question, and I know we are way over time. I wanted to thank everyone. I know a lot of people have dropped off, but I want to thank everyone for their attention and patience for this marathon, unexpected marathon of a program. I especially want okay.
非常感谢，今天我们拖得很久，可是非常感谢大家 跟随我们、参与我们。
I also wanted to acknowledge that we had such a wealth of personal experience that was shared here, a lot of wisdom, a lot of very vulnerable stories were shared, and I feel that we've been given a form of grace from everyone who really came forward and shared your really important experiences, and I hope they were heard clearly.
还有 John 他说他觉得我们今天呢，大家能够分享了很多非常非常珍贵的个人的经验，很大的智慧，像这3位优秀的学生 ，OK， 洪老师，我们要继续持续下去，要能够继续的大家互相分享。
I also wanted to thank Jennifer Sang for doing a lot of the legwork, but unfortunately not being able to be here, and rather taking the baton and doing a great job and giving us a sense of the nuts and bolts of how do you build a case? Because the advocacy is important, but also knowing how systems work and how to really get accountability is also important.
所以这样他也要特别的感谢 Jennifer 帮我们准备了这么好的资料，非常非常感谢 Robin Lipp 他今天来帮我们解释这么多详细的法律上的一些非常珍贵的资料啊。这样他说呢，就是宣导是非常重要的一样事情，可是在同时我们也需要理解法律上程序是什么，我们本身的权利有哪些，这些都是大家多方面要能够共同的才能够达到的目标。
And I also learned to acknowledge all the work that goes into providing the interpretation. Thank you so much, Agnes, for keeping up with all of us.
So happy to be with all of you.
For this much more lengthy program than we had originally contemplated, but you've really given us a window into how much hard work it is to provide this service and ensuring clear communication. It's been a great example.
Thank you. I'm very enlightened today.
Say that one more time, I didn't catch it.
I'm very enlightened today.
I'm feeling that way too. But I'm going to close this up. I want to thank everyone again, both the panelists and Agnes and all our attendees. I know we started off with about 36, 37. We're now down to 7, but I think a lot of people got a lot of insight from attending this. And I want to thank everyone for joining together and having this session. And I hope good things come out of it. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us.
还要非常感谢大家今天来参与我们，跟随我们这么长的时间 ，OK， 我们今天分享了很多宝贵的资料，也很感谢这么多人留下来听我们听到最后，希望我们以后能够再有机会来分享，非常非常感谢。
All right, good night. Go have dinner, everyone. Bye.